Test, test.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. How are you, Mark?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I think we've only talked like once before over a year ago.
Something like that. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Well, I'm glad you're here, or else I would just be staring at the screen.
Yeah, no, it's good to be here. Glad to talk to you again.
Yeah. So I know you and we had talked about doing a conversation and I figured we could try to have a conversation live on Jacob's channel. But I know that if anyone else wants to join, or if people start chatting, this could become something different than a conversation. So, but yeah, this is an opportunity for us to talk, and unless other people start to join and want to participate. But
Yeah.
the topic we had kind of zoned in on was error correction. It seems like a really important topic. It's one of those topics I've been interested in for a few years now.
Yeah, no, error correction is really important, right? We're living in a world where we're having problems with sense making, right? Or understanding what's quote real and what's not. And a lot of that's wrapped up in error correction. Like, what is the process by which we check our ideas, right? And what is the process that allows us to know when those ideas are a little bit wrong? And that's error correction, roughly speaking. And there's error correction in the computer field, right, all over the place. There's actually lots of error correction, far more than we need. But we don't have much in the way of error correction, in our lives. And I think the reason why some of this came up, you mentioned, is I was talking about on the last time I was on Jacob's stream here. I was talking about how we had that incident with Nathan, and he was, basically being a bad faith actor. And to verify that, I have a trick that I use that,
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool.
Things.
That you ran a test and you were able to basically check to see that how Nathan is perceiving the world and how he is trying to engage with you. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's error correction, right? I'm like, I've got this assumption that he's a troll. He seems to be acting in bad faith. How do I verify that? Right? What's the error correcting code that will tell me whether or not I'm misperceiving something or he's actually here as a bad faith actor? And so, I have a bunch of these little tests. I probably couldn't list them all off the top of my head, but I have a bunch of them and they work. And are they perfect? No, because nothing's perfect, but I don't need to be perfect, right? Like, it's not a requirement. And when I don't hold myself to a high standard, I find I can do a lot more stuff in the world. So, when you have somebody you think is narcissistic or self-involved or egoic, you can make a generic statement that just equally applies to everybody. And if they think it's that you're talking to them, they're stuck, right? They have a problem. And so that's an error check, because I don't want to just assume, oh, you're trolling because you're a troll, right? Because maybe I'm wrong, right? So you need those tests.
Yeah, underneath it is like there's a goal, right? For why, what are you doing and what are you trying to accomplish? And then someone like Nathan comes in and there's a question of, is there a complementary goal with the two people? One of my goals has always been, or for a long time been, learning, which is easier, a controlled learning. It's nice if I could teach, but that's not something I necessarily control, but it is something I try to practice. But yeah, how do you feel? Like, what is the goal? When I know I'm guessing you're a moderator at the John Vervaeke server, at the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis server. Is that true?
No, I've never been a moderator or an administrator of that server in any capacity at all, on purpose, right?
Okay.
And yeah, and because it's not my role, it's not what I wanted. It's a lot of work. I've done these things before. It's a lot of work, so I didn't even want that, right?
Okay, so you mentioned you're like a community builder. I heard you say that as well. Okay.
Yeah.
And so whenever you ran your test with Nathan, you were able to get a judgment for if he was willing to participate in a way that is acceptable for what the goal was with that group of people.
Right. Or not even willing, but even able. I mean, look, so it's not that some people are unwilling. Like, some people really try to participate, but they don't have the skills. And like, well, fair enough. Like,
that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's why, like, people get upset. They're like, oh, he's not a troll because he doesn't mean to do it. I'm like, I don't care if you mean to do it. I'm a pragmatist. If you're trolling, you're trolling. I don't care about your motivations or whether or not you understand your motivations. It doesn't matter to me because I don't have access to that information. But the information I do have access to is around this error correction. right? So if someone's too narcissistic or too self-involved or too egoic or whatever, there's a variety of ways to think about it. Then they can't participate. They can't cooperate with others, and that's fine. They need to start in a community with other people that are closer to where they're at, right? In order before they can step on that path, right? So, he just wasn't going to be able to engage. He didn't want to
Yep.
engage. He wanted to find a cult, and we weren't a cult. So, he wasn't going to be able to do what he wanted to do in our environment. And he said that. Like, I'm not trying to
Yeah.
disparage the guy. He said what he said. It's in the text channels.
Yeah.
Go back and look, right? And that's fine. But we weren't in a cult, and that didn't work. And his characterization of how to find a cult may have been correct, but it didn't apply to us. And he couldn't error correct, right? He couldn't say, well, I'm asking all these questions and I'm not getting the answers that I expect, right? Which, is weird. If you're not getting the answers you expect, maybe you're wrong. Like, that happens. Like, happens to me.
Yeah.
It happens to everybody, right? And so you didn't have any other way of engaging and saying, well, maybe the error that needs to be corrected is my perception, right? And the thing that I did to him was to correct my perception, right? It also happens to serve that if you do something like that and they latch onto it, they'll latch on with anger and resentment. And then everybody sees them being angry and resentful and says, oh, right. So it wasn't just about me. It was about exposing him to everybody else, because at the time he was just basically come into the meditation Sangha and was disturbing everybody, and people were getting really upset. And the problem is that, these are my friends. Like, if you want to come at me, come at me. I don't care. You're probably not significant enough in my mind that I care about your stupid opinion, right? But don't screw up my friends. Like, they're good people and they're trying to be nice to you, and you're being a jerk. And that really upset me. And as the member of that community of the meditation Sangha, it's partly my responsibility, and I would argue everybody's responsibility, to protect everybody else and protect the sanctity of the Sangha, right? And we're a group of people. We have a little meditation community going. It's our responsibility to be, careful with it and not let other people break it, because we had our problems and people broke a bunch of stuff on that server, just never the meditation Sangha. So, we protected it. And once it became apparent from my error correction that he was just an angry, resentful person that wanted something to be true that wasn't true, he got thrown off the server. And like, it's so hard to get thrown off that server. It's kind of amazing, but he did it.
I got you. So you were able to run a test that made it obvious to the moderators what kind of goals he had being there, which were not compatible with anyone's goals who were participating in that meditation, for example, or anything else on the Awakening for a Meaning Crisis server.
Right. And also, not just that, but also reveal that he was angry and that he was resentful and that he was looking for a channel for that, and that he was unable, at least in that moment, to engage with what should have been a wonderful conversation, because we have wonderful conversations in the after meditation chats when we engage in that. And for whatever reason at that time, and maybe this has changed, he wasn't there, and it became obvious to them that they weren't going to make any more progress, and they were very polite and asked him to stop and being antagonistic, although not in those terms, and he couldn't do it, which is fine. And then it's like, well, if you can't behave, then you have to go. And it's important to expose that, because I could come up with tests, and like, I was already certain he was trolling, whether he meant to or not, again, not relevant. But I could go on that and tell an administrator and say, look, I think he's trolling, and you know me, I'm always right about these things, or whatever. Yeah. I could have done that, but it was more important that the error correction reveal, also to Nathan, right? And obviously it didn't, but it should have showed him, oh, I have a problem. There's an error here, and I'm angry all of a sudden over nothing that was said about me or to me, right? And,
yes, and he probably should have been paying attention to the meditation. Maybe that would have helped his situation.
Exactly.
Right. There's an error, like I think with my children, I want to teach them how to kind of see their own emotions and learn to deal with emotions. And and what my thinking is, that's probably one of the most important things to learn as a foundation for everything else. So yeah, he probably would have benefited from taking the meditation seriously.
Exactly.
It's kind of
Exactly.
ironic,
It
actually.
is, it is, and those are little hints, like, "Oh, you come in here without meditating with us, you come in after, and you're having a conversation or trying to have a conversation, and that's already suspicious, right? But again,
Right.
that's not enough to indict somebody. Like people make mistakes, and sometimes people come in after because they don't want to meditate or they want to pray and they don't understand that you can pray, you can meditate, you can do whatever you want, right? We just want you to do it in our time frame together with us so that we can discuss whatever it is you did afterwards, whether it's meditation or it's prayer or it's just quiet time or it's contemplation. It doesn't really matter. Like we're not holding people, we're not a cult, we're not holding people to a
So
standard.
so what is that? So I like one of the things I like to do when people criticize me is I like to try to imagine that they are right. And so that's like, what did he mean by cult, and what did you hear by cult, and like why, yeah, why aren't you a cult? Why would, like, so I don't, when I hear the word cult, I think of culture, I think of a personality cult. I'm not exactly sure what people mean when they throw this word around and how it's different from a religion, or the
Right.
oldest religions or anything like that. So like, would you, if you were to just like, yeah, how do you define cult, and why would you take offense to what he was saying when he said that?
Yeah, I'll do it sort of in reverse order, right? So what he did was he accused us of being a cult, and we said, okay, how? Because to your point, like, well,
Okay.
what do you mean when you use that word, right? And then he didn't give a satisfying answer, right? He gave answers like, well, you all believe the same thing, and at the time there was a Buddhist in the room, right?
Okay. Okay.
There were as there was an agnostic in the room,
So his
there
his
was a
definition
Christian in the
was like,
room,
there was,
right?
everyone has the same core beliefs or something like that.
Right, and he kept asking, "Well, what do you all believe that's the same?" And we were like, "Yeah, absolutely nothing." And it really
Okay.
was not like there's very little overlap. It just, we didn't, you might call them metaphysical beliefs, although I don't like that word. I just did a video on my channel on navigating patterns about that word. I hate that word, but
What
they're
what
talking about religion, right?
what's the word you
Metaphysics,
hate?
metaphysics.
Metaphysics. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
know that has a technical definition as well, but I'm not very good with
yeah,
technical definitions. I try to take a word and make it fit into my experience, and so I've
right.
managed to do that with that word, but I know it doesn't mean the same thing in my mind that it means to people who, for example, studied philosophy, for example.
Right, right. But usually what they're talking about is religion. And then a cult being the root word of culture, a cult is, we'll say, the core like thing that brings people together, right? And so that would be, your core beliefs. And a cult is a mini religion or a failed religion or an incomplete religion, right? And usually cults are parasitic and they're self-referential, right? It's like, oh, we're going to reference the person that runs the thing and that's going to be our reference for everything and bow down to the swami or the guru or whatever it is, right? That's usually how people think of cults. But to your point, I mean, I was perfectly happy to ask Nathan, and we did, what do you mean by cult? How do you think that we are being a cult? Because there could be to your point, there could be a legitimate criticism there and maybe we don't see it. But he couldn't bring the goods. That's when
Yeah.
I was suspicious that, look, if you can't bring the goods, you don't have a definition ready at hand. What are you measuring? Because you need a definition to do a measurement. It's not
Right.
that hard. It isn't magic. It's just regular science. You need a definition to measure against before you can do a measurement. And he didn't have that. And so that was suspicious, right?
Okay. Yeah. I guess, so you had mentioned, like, your definition. You had mentioned like self-referential and kind of pointing at some central figure. Um, but I guess if you look at the ecosystem of like this little corner or some server, some Discord server, um, it does seem like sometimes you end up with some people who end up, getting the most attention, right, within that
Mhm.
within that community.
Yeah.
And then you also, there are some practices that that kind of bind everyone together, right? So,
Yeah.
but the thing is, if you put it that way, it doesn't necessarily sound bad. But you could, but if that's how you define cults, then all of a sudden it's no longer a bad word.
Well, look, I mean, a cult tries to fit you into a small parasitic box,
There you go. You said
right?
parasitic.
Yeah, all of you. Yeah.
So a parasitic relationship would be that there is no benefit for the you know the majority or anyone that are participating in that organization, something like that, right? So
Well, parasitic means that it's not self-reliant, right? So cults typically feed on some other thing, right? So a cult might get people by grabbing them out of churches, for example, right? They might say, "Oh, you disenfranchised with the church? Yeah, me too," right? And so what are they doing? They're not generating their own followers. They're grabbing people who already follow, right, and sucking them into their system, right? Or they're embedded in a governmental structure or in a church, right? Because a lot of churches, Christian churches have cults, right? Like Westboro Baptist is a cult, and it's self-referencing, but and it's parasitic. It's parasitic on a larger, the Baptist tradition, roughly speaking, right? Westboro Baptist, right? It's not, but they're really generating their own beliefs, right? They're not actually generating anything that people can live within, like a large enough story, for example.
okay, yeah, it seems like cult is usually the word that's put out there for that group of people that you disagree with, right? So
Well, it often is, but again, I mean, there is a difference. I mean, part of the problem is, when you live in this postmodern deconstruction age, and I don't believe in deconstruction. I have a video on postmodernism too. I think deconstruction is a garbage concept that doesn't hold any water. When you think that you can say, "Oh, I know how to identify a cult because it has these following properties. There are rituals, right? There's a core belief that everybody adheres to, right? There's a structure of authority and hierarchy, and that's a cult." Well, that's every business in America, literally,
yeah, I was
right?
actually thinking that when you were talking about it, it's like I like to think
Right.
about organizations in general, and so I'm trying to imagine, like, there is a way to organize that would be the ideal, and then
Right.
there's things that are at various degrees worse than that, and
Right.
anywhere along that spectrum of worseness, you could say, well, that's the line in the sand which I call a cult, but right,
Right, but a company is building something that doesn't exist without the company, and it is therefore not parasitic in design, right? And the fact that structures exist and you need structures to do things to enable groups of people to do things is just a fact. And structures are not ideal because ideals, live in an ideal world. We live in a fallen world, roughly speaking, right? Uh, there's no way around that, right? Sorry. But you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You shouldn't say, "Well, all groups of people form structures, and therefore all structures are indicative of cults, and therefore they're all bad," like, because people do that all the time, and that's a mistake. That's an error in thinking, and
yeah,
you need an error correction, like noticing
yeah.
structure is everywhere and some structures seem to be good.
Let's see. We got a comment here. Nathan's video made me feel sad for him. Really, he refuses to acknowledge his own stated beliefs are as in group out group as the Petersonians or this little corner. It's laughable. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad that he has that attitude, and it's sad that a bunch of people on that server, I don't know what happened with him and BOM because I didn't pay any attention at all, but it's sad that the people on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis server tried to reach out to him and he didn't see that. He could only see a threat, which, I think that's sad. They weren't threatening anybody, and they were just trying to help because we're all there, helping each other, especially, back then. That was sort of early on. It was well over a year ago now, I think.
Yeah,
So yeah, it is sad, but you can see what the postmodern deconstructionism gets you, right? It gets you this adversarial relationship, needless adversarial relationship with groups that you don't need to have an adversarial relationship with because they're not out to hurt you or do anything to you, or and if you're constantly trying to be an individual in the world, you're rejecting all these relationships that you could have in communities, and you need those communities, you know.
yeah, yeah, I agree. So, yeah, Jacob is thinking of making a video. He's connecting Nathan with Dunning Kruger. That could be an interesting one.
Yeah,
The
it's not a bad idea. Yeah.
the So yeah, and as far as error correction goes, there's the individual level. There's things like how do I, uh, learn, right? How do I, and then
Right.
how fast can I do it, and then similarly, you could say, well, how does Mark learn, or how does Nathan learn? And then there's this thing we started talking about organizations. It's like, how does an organization learn? So, you know, to like, I think it's true that like the organization consists of humans, and it can't be. It's obviously not going to be perfect because humans aren't perfect. But then there's a question for me that I'm very interested in is the learning process. The learning process as an individual, and then also the learning process for groups. For my family, for my marriage, and for my family and my community and my business. The business I work for. And in a Discord server, for example. I'm interested in that process as well. So ideally, as the error correction happens, you end up with changes, and you end up with measurements that you can track over time, in order to accomplish some goal that has to do with. Well, the thing is you can pick your goal, right? Each
Mhm.
organization picks their goal. For a company, it might be something like productivity and efficiency, or money, or things like that. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
when
usually
we
the
talk
same
about
place.
error correction. That's what's coming to mind. It seems all connected
Mhm.
to me.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, look, you got to take Pichet seriously when he talks about the fractal nature of reality, right? And what he means is self-similar fractal, right? Because fractals aren't necessarily self-similar, but there's a self-similar fractal nature to reality. When you look at things at different layers, right, at different scales, really is what the layers are. Scale changes things, but there are pattern similarities. So what works at the scale of the individual does not work at the scale of the group largely, or at least it doesn't work the same. So the principles are intact, but the way they're implemented has to change. And this happens all over. It happens in math. It's actually kind of funny. I forget the video that I was watching, but the guy was basically he's a philosopher. It always sets off my bells. Modern philosophers are just nothing but trouble, in my opinion. And I mean all the way back, like after Plato and Aristotle, it gets a little iffy on philosophy for me. Um,
Yeah, I think you put more time into philosophy than I did. So maybe I can take the medal for my lack of knowledge for philosophy because
No,
of.
I don't know any. I don't read any philosophy. But this
Okay.
guy, his claim was that there's a contradiction. Oh, he's talking to Brett Weinstein. That's what it was. He was saying there's a contradiction between Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry. And it's like, no, there isn't. There literally isn't, right? Because in non-Euclidean geometry, for example, parallel lines never meet. That's the definition of a parallel line. But in non-Euclidean geometry, parallel lines always meet because you have three dimensions. So the fact that two dimensions and three dimensions don't work the same is not a contradiction. It's a distinction between layers of analysis, right? And he didn't seem to understand that very basic concept, which I was kind of like, oh, you need to go back to school. Or I think that's like, before high school, you learn that kind of. Anyway, but I think that that's the problem when we're not looking at it. So one method of error correction for an individual is other individuals, right? So Paul Vanderklay talks about this. We outsource our sanity, right? We do. What is outsourcing your sanity? It's using distributed cognition to some extent, which goes back to fancy Vervicky words, which I know some people have a problem with. But it's kind of important to know because if you're an individualist, you're not going to like this idea of groups and communities and people and churches and blah. I don't like that language, right? Some of the people are a lot like that. But it's important to know there is distributed cognition and that you're smarter when you're thinking with other people, as long as you're
Yeah,
doing that in a generative way.
this
So
is
that's
where
part of error correction, right?
yeah, this is where it's. I don't know I'm curious about your experience and I'm assuming that you have some experiences similar to me in like the technical field where you can create a plan or design for some software. You can get that design reviewed. You can then kind of break that up into a bunch of pieces. You can begin implementing in small slices and allowing a customer to provide feedback. And so it's kind of the agile process, with
Right.
an initial design phase, but then also this thing that is flexible and agile and can change based on feedback from, the end user. So that's what comes to mind is like there's a connection there between, as an individual, I require feedback in order to learn most effectively. Like I could, if I was by myself, maybe I could learn, but I don't think I could learn as effectively as I can with the help with other people, right?
Right.
And then in an organization, one process that software companies has arrived at is this what I'm alluding to with designs, reviews, pull requests with commit history and reviews. And so, like, how do you, yeah, do you see that some of these techniques used in the software industry could be integrated more into society and our organizations to help with error correction?
Well, look, I mean, it depends on how far back in history you go with software design and what you think about current software design. So there is a corrective aspect to something like the agile methodology, and look, there's more versions of agile methodology than there were ways to write software back in the day, which is not a good sign, right? It tells you something's a little bit amiss. And yeah,
But there's
I'm
like
not a big.
there's a principle though. I think there's some principles and it's
Oh yeah,
based around agility,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's
Well,
like,
no,
for
I
example,
mean, yeah,
yeah,
I'll get to that.
okay,
I'll get to that,
yeah,
right? So I think that, yeah, if you have an agile software team, right? I have a lot of experience with this, right? I've got
okay,
a lot of years in software development. If you have an
that's cool.
agile team that is actually consists of, say, a senior developer and one or two mid level developers and a bunch of low level developers, that pulls the team up. But if you have a group of low level developers, the team will not get better, and because they don't have a standard to go to, right? And that's one of the problems with agile is that there's over tracking, and in the real world, it turns out that if you want to learn something and you just watch a carpenter build something, you will become a better carpenter through that process. You don't need to measure anything. You don't need that. I'm not saying you can do entirely without it, but the magic is in the mimicry and not in the training aspect where you're looking at things and measuring things and quantifying what happened, and that's not where the magic is. You can't do without it, right? But the magic is in the mimicry, and so you need to have a standard to mimic, right? You need to have an ideal to mimic, and that's what makes these things work. And you also have to have a willingness to learn. And the problem with learning, and people don't talk about this, like they talk about learning as though it's some positive only process that just makes you better. Learning is just failing over and over again until you stop failing over and over again with such regularity. That's all learning is. And
Yeah,
people don't like to fail, but I think failing's wonderful sometimes, because that's how you learn. You go, oh,
yeah,
I tried this thing and it didn't work, and now
yeah,
I've learned something. I
yeah.
thought I could do it this way, but I can't.
Yeah, it's almost like you can train yourself like Pavlov's dog, so that or the goal would be so that when there's that criticism, instead of getting that natural defense that it seems like it emerges for everybody, you could somehow trick yourself into thinking, oh wait, there might be something nice at the end of this. Maybe we
Right.
can hurry up and get to the point where I learn. I change my ways. I learn something.
Well, yeah, you have to be open to not only criticism. People say, oh, you have to be open to criticism. You have to be open to criticism and the fact that probably the criticism you're getting isn't perfect. And it can
Yeah,
be not perfect in a number of ways. So for example, if you get criticism that you do not understand for whatever reason, it doesn't matter whose fault it is, then it's not helpful criticism, period. Even if it's quote correct, right? Like if I
right,
can't communicate it to you, it's not helpful,
right,
right? Even if I'm right, right? And then there's other types of criticism where the person criticizing is making a lot of assumptions, usually through authority or, I've got 10 more years of experience in the industry than you do, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? And so they're making assumptions that aren't true. And then those parts of their criticism are wrong, but other parts of their criticism may still be right. And so we get defensive, and we should get defensive because we should defend our own ego to some extent, right? But we don't need to trick ourselves. We need to say, look, there's probably something I could learn from my failure. There's probably something I can learn from my partial success. There's probably something I can learn from somebody noticing something and speaking up about it, right? And if we have that attitude, we can grow. But if we don't have that attitude, then we fall down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's those deeply held ones that where your defenses pop up the strongest. Not all criticism and proposals for change are worthwhile. You can DDoS people with bad advice. Yeah, I agree with this. I forget I can go to lawsofux.com and they talk about some law where it's based on studies about the amount of information that can be retained within the brain. It's like I think 7 is like maybe the average, the number of things
Mhm.
we can hold in short-term memory. Definitely, we have to be careful about. We just have to be aware of the fact that our brains are limited. But
Right.
you can use technology to help with that, like taking notes, for example, right? And there's different ways to
Right.
take notes. Um, I was going to point out, yeah, I think you had mentioned, we make mistakes and we learn from our mistakes. Um, I had the opportunity at my latest job to do mob programming. Have you heard of mob programming?
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard of that. Yeah.
So, and I got teamed up with 3 other senior software engineers. So it was like me as a senior with 3 other seniors, and within 3 months, I'd learned. Like I told everyone, I said I had learned more in 3 months than I'd learned in the previous 3 years by myself. And my
Mm.
boss, he liked using that one as a quote, but I did have to tell him eventually. I said, because I got moved into a different mob. It's like it worked because they were seniors, but like when you have the senior and the new software engineers, like my growth as a senior changed, and sure, the new software engineers, the juniors, they could learn from me, but there's definitely this dynamic of trying to include people with experience and then different expertise together, and then allow them to explain themselves. As you were saying, it's
Right.
very important that you can discuss why some idea, some solution is better than others, to discuss the trade-offs. And it's nice when everybody can come to an agreement and say, yeah. The hard part is when there's a disagreement. It's like,
Right.
how do
Right.
you actually settle the disagreement whenever you have seniors,
Right.
experts who are, yeah, they just, there's a conflict and eventually someone
Right.
has to submit.
Right. Exactly. And that's the problem. Right. And this is why people don't understand leadership. Right. Because especially in software. Right. And I can speak very authoritatively in software because I've got well over 30 years experience with software development and big teams and Fortune 500s, the whole 9 yards. Like I've done it all, startups, the whole thing. Right. Especially in software, a lot of decisions about the best way to do something are actually arbitrary, right? They have different sets of trade-offs, but you know what? Senior 1, senior 2, senior 3, and senior four's idea are equal at the end of the day because they're all going to get the end result done, right? So at some point, you just need a leader to pick one, right?
Yeah.
And figure out which 3 people to piss off, because that's what's going to happen, and that's okay. But
So
you need to have that. You need to have a leader to do that, right? Or at least an authority to make that decision, because some decisions are so close, like some solutions are so close that the decision looks and could actually be, objectively, if there's such a thing, arbitrary. But you still have to pick one to move forward. Like you can't
yeah,
move forward with 4 competing ideas. And so at some point you just have to pull the trigger. And you know what? You may think they're equal and find out later that they're not.
right.
Fair enough. But that's the problem. You will never know until you implement. You never know anything until you participate, until you implement in software, be implementation, right? So the implementation tells you ultimately who was right and who was wrong. And you can't know before that point. And right, yeah,
Sometimes you just need to grope forward and be wrong.
right,
It,
exactly. And learn. But in order to do that, you have to accept that, you know, these 4 guys disagree. They're all senior. They all have about the same experience. I trust them all. They've all bailed me out of projects in the past. What do I do? Because this happens. This happens all the time in
there's a
software.
website called random.org, and that's when you say, here's senior number 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done that a few times. I know personally, I try to submit and only hold my ground when it's really important, and I tend to hold my ground like when I know it's wrong and it's going to break, and
Right,
it might just take time explaining why it's wrong and it will break.
right,
Otherwise, I'll do it the the way the other person wants. But sometimes it's sometimes the wrong decisions are made. Like I've noticed, like the decision that needs to be made about design, for example, will depend on the size of the organization, right? So the
Right.
right answer becomes wrong in a different organization because now you need to do microservices to handle
Well,
scale, right?
size of organization, size of customer base, right? There's scale all over the place, and all
Yeah,
those different scales affect design in a profound way. You can't just code something up to work on your desktop and expect it to scale all the way up to working with a million people hitting it all at once. That's not realistic. I've seen companies do it. Every single one I've seen do it goes out of business. Right? If you don't change your software when your user base changes scale, and I can't tell you what that scale point is because it changes based on the product and based on what you're doing, right? Then you'll fail.
yeah,
And it just is what it is. And people don't want to accept that, right? They want one solution that's going to scale infinitely because technology makes the promise of scaling infinitely, but it can't do that, right? That's unrealistic. It can scale a lot better than most other things, but it
yeah,
can't do that. And that's the mistake we make as individuals too. I mean, this is why there's error correction everywhere. So in a computer, unbeknownst to most people, there's error correction built into your memory to protect it from X-rays, because bits get flipped in your RAM based on X-rays. It's very rare, right? And you can add additional enhancement by buying ECC memory and stuff. And like the servers do that, right? When you get cloud servers, that's why their memory is expensive. They have special, even more error correction, and disks have error correction on the platter level. And then they have error correction on the controller level. And then there's error correction in the protocol level, right? There's just error correction everywhere in the stack. There's so many pieces of error correction that it actually slows machines down quite a bit, and we don't actually realize it. Some of it's not necessary. Right. And so you can look back on the history of something like modems, right? When we used to call other computers, right, from our computer before all this handy fiber and high-speed internet and copper internet to the house stuff, right? And what would happen is, in the early days, phone connections were terrible on average, and modems were operating within the voice range, so they were very slow. And then any file transfer you did, you'd have like a protocol like X modem or XY modem, right? And things like this to do error correction. Now, you're already doing error correction below that. And when the better modems came out, the error correction was automatic and it was really good. So like when you get to 54 or is it 56.4 and 19.2 and stuff like that, they have error correction at the bottom layer. You didn't need file level error correction anymore. It wasn't necessary. You take it out and you get a lot more speed, right? Because you're running at line speed, because line speed is basically the error correction is already built in. So you can see that error correction is a big part in technology, and it's everywhere. There's probably too much of it, if anything. But we need error correction, personally too, right? We need it in our groups. We need it in our leadership. We need it in our structures, right? Because when we don't error correct our structures, we don't change our structures based on errors that we're seeing, that's when they get corrupted.
Yeah. There's something I've heard Joe Rogan mention quite a few times. His recommendation to people is to ignore criticism. And like I recently went through How to Win Friends and Influence People, and never split the difference. And like one of the things that came out of that is that there are many people, and I would say like including myself, especially when I was younger, it's like can receive criticism and become depressed and suicidal, and it could cause them to quit doing the thing they were passionate about. And so criticism is something that's really hard to receive, and not everyone can receive very well. But at the same time, it's essential to error correction, right? So to me, it seems like there's something in our society that we just haven't figured out yet, like how to, for example, identify people who can receive criticism well, and then trying to give them more attention, for example.
Yeah, well, I think Jacob's earlier point is dead on. Like one of the problems, and we used to have a sense for this, we don't have that sense anymore. But one of the deep problems that we have is that sometimes people are criticizing, and sometimes they're doing something else, right? In other words, they're attacking, or they're being deliberately trollish, right? Well, trolling is look, trolling looks like criticism, but it's not. It's a deliberate attempt to get a response. And so that's not criticism, right? It's not valid criticism or something. And we don't have a word for this, or we don't have a good way of talking about it. And I think trolling's one example of, we'll say, bad faith criticism or something, where you're not trying to make the person better, right? You're just trying to knock them down. And the postmodern ethos really encourages people to find errors and flaws in things, which is, roughly speaking, the trick of a 3-year-old, right?
Yeah,
Just
I
ask
think
why long enough, you'll find it. You'll find a place where there's a flaw or an error or an unknown
yeah, I
state.
think that you and I tend to agree on this one. It's like the postmodernists are focused on destroying or destruction, and they don't
Sure.
necessarily have solutions. So they don't and that's actually the hard part. Like I destroyed my deck in 4 hours and then spent 3 months rebuilding it. Right. So it's
Right. Right.
it's a general pattern. I'm going to show one message here. Hold your truths loosely makes error correction easier. It reminds me of
Yeah.
I had a boss who said, um, strong opinions weakly held. It sounds like those are two rhyming sentiments. So
Yeah.
definitely something
Yeah.
to think about for sure.
Right. Right. And yeah, you want to, the problem with error correction is that you have to be ready to make errors. You have to be ready to
Yeah.
acknowledge that you make errors, right? And then you have to have a good way to understand, is this criticism aimed at making me better, or is it aimed at tearing me down? Right? Because that's really, what is the goal here? And people tend to react to things in the moment. And that's, look, if
So
there's
one,
a tiger in the bush, you're going to react in the moment, right? But we're
yeah,
not living in that world quite so often anymore. Occasionally, right?
yeah,
But when we treat criticism like a tiger in the woods and we react right away, that's a problem, because our general reaction to tiger in the woods is to protect ourselves, which is the correct response, by the way. Just in case you didn't realize that, if there's a tiger stalking you, the correct
mm,
response is to protect yourself.
I
And so I
actually,
understand,
yeah,
right? But
that's,
but with criticism, we have to be able to draw a line and say, well, is this good criticism? Does it make me better? Or is this something that I can't learn from? For whatever reason, it might be communicated bad, it might be good criticism communicated badly. These things happen, right?
yeah,
And then you need to move from there.
yeah. And I recently received some criticism, and at work, and I when I looked back at it, I uh, I knew that when I used a certain word, OUR, I said R, and I used it within the context of a smaller group. And so one of the people within that smaller group perceived it and interpreted it one way, but then another person who's like my boss read it and perceived it like as a larger group. And so depending on how you interpret that OUR, it was confusing. It would come off as being something wrong or disrespectful. But anyways, I could have used better words. So I took the criticism in that regard as I can communicate better. But then on the
Right.
other hand, there's one thing I've noticed is that there's always trade-offs. Like when you're making decisions about software design, for example, there's trade-offs, and then there's trade-offs as an individual and with humans as well. It's like I have strengths, but then with those strengths will come weaknesses, and so I think everyone has to realize that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and so like my plan is to actually have a conversation where I point at you know the strengths, like these are the strengths, but because and get the conversation partner to agree. It's like these are the strengths, but because these are the strengths, that means that there's things that will not be done well. These are the corresponding weaknesses, and so then you
Right.
try to fit people within an organization so that there is this overlap. The people you're put into a role and a position where your strengths and weaknesses are a best fit for the organization. Like that's the kind of thing I think we have a lot to learn as a society on how we should do that, and that's where I put a lot of my hope as far
Mhm.
as like
Yeah. I mean,
figuring out this problem seems like one of the most important problems to me.
yeah, and actually, the real problem is we already figured that out. We already know how to do all this. It's just people don't want to hear it, right? They're like, "Oh no, I don't want to do it that way because that way is bad." It's like, yeah, but it works.
Tell us,
And
Mark.
well, look, I mean, Jonathan Blow did a talk. He's a semi-famous game developer, right? He did a talk about the fall of civilization or something. I think that Fall of Civilization was the title or something. And he pointed out the thing I've been talking about for a lot longer than he has, which is that all of our software is getting more and more buggy, like horrifically more buggy. And he said, if you just start paying attention to your devices that run on software and really paying attention, you'll see there's bugs all over the place. Like this foolish thing, this Android phone, forget it. Like it doesn't work at all. Like it just, and that's an expensive phone. That's not a cheap phone. That's a $1,200 phone. It doesn't work.
And I mean, as software engineers, we know this. And whenever people think there's a conspiracy, oftentimes I'm like, no, it's probably a bug because I know what's going into this.
Well, they don't test anything anymore, right? So in software, for example, you can see this quite clearly, right? They don't test anything anymore.
Yeah, we see how the sausage is made. We see how the hot dogs are made if you're in the software engineering world, right?
Right. When you're in the software engineering, you realize, because look, this is my bread and butter, right? I used to go in and do release engineering among other things, right? And I'd say like, you need a QA environment, and they're like, no, we're gonna push everything directly to production, right? And that's a disaster every time because the software engineers are assuming that their code works, that it works perfectly, and that their unit tests, which are usually tests of individual pieces of software not running anywhere, are sufficient. And of course, mathematical modeling, which we have and has been done and was done, that work was done, I believe, in the 70s, if my memory serves, shows you that cannot work, period. There are mathematical models that show you why unit testing, things like unit testing, don't work, right, or can't work. And that's important to know, that we have systems that do work, that did work, that produced 5 years ago. My phone was much more stable. All of the notifications worked. It always updated the weather app with the current temperature. You can't do any of those things now. And notifications are completely random. And it's not just my phone either. I've watched other people's phones. They are just as broken. So it's not a hardware thing. It's not a, which carrier are you with? It's not a which version of Android you're running. Like all of this stuff is more broken.
So I want to get us back to the answer, but it does remind me of there's a guy I know who's kind of an artist, and I showed him my work one time, and I said, "You want to help me make this look better?" And his response was, "Yeah, I'll help you polish that turd." And it's like that's really what you got is you look at this phone and it's like very polished, but but underneath the hood there's bugs. There's things that don't work.
Right. So, well, look, I mean, it's really in what you value, right? Now, when you automate in software, when you automate your release stream so that you can release software quicker, what you get are more releases. Okay. Right. But again, if you just kind of think about the math, I'm not talking about anything else, just think about the math. More releases equals more bugs. It has to. There's no way around that equation, right? So if you want fewer bugs, but you want fewer releases, automatically. And people don't like to hear that. They're like, no, we got to get the latest feature out or whatever. And,
I'm actually I switched to site reliability engineering in January. And so, they talk about reliability versus velocity. That's your trade-off. Right. So that's exactly what you're talking about. So if you want to have velocity where you're putting out new features, it means you're sacrificing reliability. And if you want to have reliability, it means you have to sacrifice velocity, and there's no way around it.
Exactly. And the thing is, the software industry never cared about velocity until about 10 or 15 years ago. Never cared. It was not, because releases were expensive. Release processes were not automated. They were hand done. That has advantages and disadvantages. But at the end of the day, you put out better quality software, and it took you a lot longer to release it. And look, when you change software, there's a bunch of support and maintenance work that has to get done and change. And the more often you release software, the harder it is to do all that, right? Especially with high velocity, right? Because what ends up happening is, somewhere down the line, you introduce bugs that aren't bugs until you hit a scaling point. And now all of a sudden a bug appears that was never there, but it's been in the software for 2 years. I've had to fix this at organizations. This is not a rare occurrence. And they didn't know it was going to be a bug when you hit 120,000 users a second, right? But it was always there, right? But they never tested, so they never knew.
Right. So the original kind of question I'm playing with was, the idea of how do we uh, create organizations that are kind of like the most ideal competence hierarchy that accounts for individuals' strengths and weaknesses. And then you had said that we know how to do this, and it sounds
Yeah.
like part of the answer maybe has something to do with a lack of patience, or we're moving fast, but is that it, or are there other things that are coming to mind as far as
Well,
the answer to how we can organize effectively?
there's a lot of things. So if you look at something like agile, and if you actually dig into the history of agile, history, computer history is something I know a lot about, right? I studied, and this is my industry. I know a lot about it. Studied all the history as far back as you can go. Right, multiplexing starts with the Jacquard loom, right, and then gets picked up by IBM. Like we're going all
Okay.
the way back, right? We're going back as far as we can, right? Pre mechanical computers. These concepts were already in existence,
Yeah, my
right?
first
And then
language was C in college, and C and
right,
Java. So I think
right, right.
I did some assembly just in one class, but yeah, basically that's where I started. Basically third, fourth generation languages,
Right. Well, and
which
it
there,
and
there
it
are
matters,
generations and layers. So I haven't.
right? But
I've
but
been.
it
I've
but
managed to
it
stay
matters
away
a
from
lot.
those. Yeah.
It matters a lot, right? Because if you don't understand how to do your own memory management, you won't understand in Java why you're reading in a file that's 100 meg and allocating 5 gigs of memory. You won't understand immediately that's a red flag. People don't. I worked on a project like, and more than one, but this was the most egregious one. They were reading in a tiny file. They're allocating 5 gigs of memory in Java to process the file. I'm like, there's no way that's right. And if you're a C programmer, you know right away what's wrong. Like you can tell there's a mathematical way to look at the memory allocation and go, oh, well, we must be over allocating, every time we read. Yeah, okay.
Hmm.
And if you understand programming languages well enough, you know exactly what that flaw is and how it came to be. You may not be able to find it and fix it easily because Java can, especially if you're doing like aspect oriented programming in Java can be a mess to read because all the code that you're running isn't in one place. You can't view the execution path, right? So you run into these problems, but they're bigger than that. So one of the things that Agile brings into the picture is the purpose of Agile, and Bob Martin, Uncle Bob Martin on YouTube talks about this, right?
Hmm.
The purpose of Agile was a, believe, 10 or 15 person company. They were all senior engineers with more than 10 years of engineering experience, software engineering experience. And their stated goal was to come up with a way to build software that did not involve any middle level management. That means no project managers and no bosses of any kind, right? This works great for a small company. And if you're a small company of 10 to 15 people and it's almost all senior level software engineers, I mean, you probably need a CEO to make management decisions, right? You probably need a marketing guy and you probably need an accountant, right? But if your software team is really just all, then maybe Agile is the perfect way to develop software for you. Maybe. But if that's not you, because that's what Agile was designed, that was the problem Agile was designed to solve, maybe you shouldn't be an Agile shop. I'm not
Right.
saying that definitely you can't make it work, but maybe Agile is the wrong answer. Or maybe Agile only works at the small group level and you can't scale it up. So SAFe, right, is scaled agile framework, some things, right? Right, where you do agile all the way up the chain at every layer of the project. It's ridiculous. It doesn't work very well. I've had to fix many, many of those because I'm just like, yeah, you just can't run things like this. It doesn't work. We had management structures in the past that worked, in the 70s and 80s and in the 90s in the software industry. We had great management structures. We had great group structures where, we get together cross-functional teams. And you can argue, well, that's not agile enough, but it's better because it produces better software, right? And it produces better everything, actually. I've seen it in manufacturing, right? Where, the engineers never talk to the guys on the floor until you get a cross-functional team together, and then all of a sudden magic happens, right? And it's like, well, we want to do that all the time. Yeah, but you can't, because if you bother the engineers all the time with every little niggly thing that's happening on the production floor, then they can't sit down and do good engineering. Like, it's a trade-off. So once a year, once every 2 years, whatever it is, you get the engineering team together with the floor team for a month, and then they work out all the flaws that way. That's the best way to go. It's a good trade-off. It's worked for years in the industry, in all kinds, in every industry. And we've sort of said, we don't want that management style in software. We want to be fast. We want to have high velocity. We want to be able to adapt to the changing. The world doesn't change that fast. The world doesn't, and I can prove that. This phone for 3 months has been giving me 10 updates a week at a minimum. Okay. I only have 120 apps on here. So 10 updates a week means they're changing all kinds of things all over the place. Do you know what I haven't figured out? What is changing? Because the user interface doesn't seem to be changing for most of these things. There's a couple of apps that have a couple new features, but I don't know what they're changing. It doesn't have an impact on how I use the phone. Now, the phone is less stable, so it seems to have an impact on how well the phone works, but it doesn't have an impact on how I'm using it. So I'm very suspicious. What are you changing exactly? Why are you making changes that the end user doesn't notice? What is that? Like, that's crazy to me. Like, why would you do that? Why don't you bundle all these changes in with a UI change so that I know that I'm getting something? Because right now the phone just updating 10, 15, 30 apps a week sometimes. And I don't know I don't understand I don't see a change. Like, I don't know what they're doing. So that's not better, right? Quarterly software release would be a much better model. It's just that people don't want to do it anymore, right? They're trying to measure velocity. They're using quantity. How many releases did we do, right? They're not using how successful were the releases. Did anyone care about the releases, right? Did anything actually happen as a result of the releases? And were those things better or worse, right? Did we get more or less engagement? Companies don't tend to measure that when they're doing software development.
So according to Mark, a lot of organizations try to move too fast, and the organizations need to have cross-functional teams.
They need more separation. Right. Look, more, I mean, sitting in a group.
What do you mean? You say more separation, right? Or what are you saying?
They need more separation. Look, sitting in a group with cubes is no good for people, right? It makes them feel like cattle, and maybe they can hear the good idea. Okay, look, in a small company, when you got 15 people and you got one really smart guy and a bunch of people with crazy ideas, and then the smart guy is able to use a crazy idea in a way that a junior engineer doesn't understand how brilliant their crazy idea happened to be, right? Yeah, that happens. But it's extraordinarily rare. Like, it almost never happens, right? And look, there's things like pairs programming. And yeah, I did pair programming with somebody and I was very skeptical of it. I was like, another one of these freaking, agile style, extreme programming sort of, from the new, and it was great. It was wonderful. It was fantastic. Right. And I was able to learn from the person I was paired up with.
It depends on who you get matched up with.
Right. And that's the problem, is that the real problem is the team mix still matters. Right. And so you need clear lines of separation, because every crazy idea from a junior engineer that you happen to hear, look, they had water coolers back in the day for a reason. Like, and we used to use the snack room to exchange ideas. Right. Like because at one point I was a senior support engineer for a large disk array product. And we had a snack room. And then when you needed to let the software engineers know something that maybe you thought didn't get through to them through the normal channels, you'd go in the snack room. And if one of the guys who ran that particular piece of the software was there, you might let slip, I had a case the other day and here's what happened, right? And then suddenly a bug gets fixed. Now that bug probably never made it as a bug because the technical engineering teams and the other teams don't have good communication sometimes, right? And I would say that's a management failure already, which you could fix, right? Yeah. But it got fixed, so who cares?
So have you ever worked with large companies remotely? Have you done that yet?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of that work. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the water cooler at that point has to end up being a channel, or it has to be some regular meeting of some kind, and it has to and then, so for example, there's a bugs meeting, right? And that's where everyone comes in and talks about bugs, or there needs to be basically the creation of a roadmap on where do we want to go, right?
Right. And people get caught up with Agile as a final solution to all their software needs and all their management needs. Look, I was at a company, a cell phone company, actually. Sorry for the cell phone guy. best cell phones, light years ahead of everything. It was awesome. It's a great cell phone. And I walk in, they wanted me to help with this group. I was part of a support group, basically, right? I'm supporting the large infrastructure systems. That's part of my bread and butter. Architect and analyst, mostly of infrastructure, but also software. But they didn't want me for the software. They wanted me for the systems. But I was also known for fixing a bunch of problems, right? And so the director brought me in, and I go into this meeting with this team, and they're like, "Oh, we have this huge tech backlog from the agile process." And I go, "Oh, okay, that's pretty common. Agile just creates tech backlog. That's pretty much what it does. Technical debt, they call it, right?"
I'm aware of
And they're
that.
like, "Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what
I've
it
always,
does."
I worked with missile defense for 6 years, and we didn't really have technical debt. But then once I got out of that, there was definitely technical debt. But we were using systems that were 20 years old, right? They
Right.
did. There's
Well, if
that
you move
trade-off
slowly,
between velocity and reliability. So,
if you move slowly and you put your focus on quality, you don't have
right.
technical debt, right? Because the technical gets resolved by resolving the quality.
And it
So
has to. And when you're doing like
right, and it has to.
missiles,
Right,
so,
that's the thing. You slide the release date to make sure the software works. I
right.
think that's the best way to do software. I'm prepared to be wrong, but like, show me the good. So what this team was doing, and I asked them, I said, "Well, look, how long are your sprints?" And they're like, 2 weeks. And I'm like, "Okay." And they say, "We release every 2 weeks." And I said, "That's not right. Like, what are you doing?" And I said, "So when do you do your releases?" "On a Friday." And I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me." In the software industry, I mean, this is years ago, but even back then, everybody knew you don't release on a Friday. You don't ever release anything on a Friday ever. Like, this is well known in the software industry. What are you doing? You can't do that, right? So
I thought this comment was funny. So there are some points I want to make. This is an interesting point. If you move too slowly, you can move too slowly.
right.
But that's an interesting point. Let's all stick with 5.25-inch hard disk.
Right. But there's a sweet spot, right? So the other thing they were doing is they had one team. So what happened was they were jumping from sprint to sprint with no break in between the sprints at all. So on Monday, they started sprint planning. So on the weekend, when software engineers, because this is how Agile works, right? The software engineers are doing all the work. They're doing all the support work. They're doing all the release work. They're doing, right? These guys are on call, which I'm like, I would never put a software engineer on call. Like, no. If you're putting software engineers on call, you're doing something wrong. You're paying them a lot of money. They should be smart enough that they don't need to be on call. And the people that are on call should be the engineers that are managing and maintaining the system.
This is what Amazon does. I think Amazon has on-call. I interviewed with Amazon, and they basically said you got to be on call rotation like every 2 or 3 weeks or something.
They have SMEs who are on call, right? And that's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable model. But they don't put their software engineers. I mean, they might have software engineers on call, and maybe you need one software engineer on call, whatever. But generally,
I think they had a rotation they have like 10-person software engineering teams, and then they rotate a software engineer to be on call every so often.
But what this company was doing was jumping from sprint to sprint. And so what happened is not only did they have engineers on call on the weekend to get all the bugs, but they would put all those bugs into the next sprint. It's like, okay, but you don't have a gap between sprints, and you don't have two teams. Because if you have two teams, you just leapfrog the teams. Not that I recommend any of this. First of all, I'm not even sure I recommend Agile. I mean, I'll do Agile. My customer wants Agile, I'll do Agile all day long. I don't care. And I'll fix it for you. I'll make it better for sure. Right. Yeah. But if somebody asked me, like, should we be doing Agile? I would say, no, absolutely not. Don't ever do Agile ever. I think it's terrible. There's much better ways to do your software than Agile. Right. So, and I'm not saying you don't steal some of the methodologies, but no, I wouldn't run a software project.
Yeah. When you say Agile, you probably mean some specific implementations, but underneath there are principles, right?
Well, look, right. Look, again, if you have individual teams, right, maybe you make them Agile teams individually. Right. And maybe you don't make all your teams Agile, because I wouldn't do that, actually. It depends on the size of the team and the mix of the people, right? And whether or not you have offshoring. If you have offshoring, Agiles actually can be really good for offshoring if you set it up right. And there's a trick to that for sure. There's several tricks to that, and I happen to know a few of them. So I can make your outsource teams a lot more efficient. Like that's not hard to do at all, especially with Agile. But maybe you don't run Agile for your teams in house. Like that's a thing I've proposed before. But look, if you're running Agile leapfrog teams and you have one team on maintenance of the last release and then they switch to doing the new version, that's an okay way to do Agile. And that's what I recommended to them. I said, split your team into two and do this, because they were hell bent on releasing every 2 weeks. And I was like, well, I wouldn't release every 2 weeks, but if you're hell bent on releasing every 2 weeks, here's how I would fix that problem, right? So the way it's implemented actually matters. And the smarter companies that use Agile for the development phase, and they're not always doing Agile. Like, because Agile doesn't, it talks about a design phase, but most people ignore that. Take the design phase. That's not an Agile thing. It's not part of Agile at all. It never was. It was never intended to be. Agile was never intended to have design as a major feature. And go back to the 80-20 rule, where it's 80% design and 20% coding. Why? Because when you do that, you only need junior engineers for the most part. You don't need all senior engineers. Agile is designed to maximize a group of entirely senior engineers and make them as super efficient as you can get them. That's great if that's what you have. If that's not what you have, you can't use it as effectively.
Yeah, this is back to the way you organize or the way you design things just depends on the context of the situation. So if you have the right team, Agile may be a good fit. If you have the right customers, it may be a good fit. The one thing that came to mind is Elon Musk. So I'd read an article how what was it? Not SpaceX. The satellites that he has. I forget what they're Starlink. So Starlink was able to respond in Ukraine faster than like the Defense Department could, and which isn't surprising because my experience with the Defense Department is things move in years, whereas I'm thinking Starlink was able to move in weeks and months. And so there is this, there are these trade-offs, between velocity and reliability and trying to hit that sweet spot where sometimes it's nice to, if you can have a team that's able to move fast and avoid, having bugs that ends up costing people's lives, for example.
Right. But look, Starlink had a lot of bugs when it was first released. It took them a long time. All they did was software updates and software updates and software updates. And now they have roaming capability. And they didn't have that before. Right. So they built the velocity into the right place. What's the velocity? The ability to move the satellites around. That's where their velocity is. Right. And the DoD doesn't consider things like that because they run to mil-spec. And I've worked on DoD projects and, they're painful. Like there's mil-spec is endless seemingly. And it's very good because you can measure results very precisely, very accurately. And that's great. But what you can't do with mil-spec is move quickly. Right. And that's why the silicon in the lunar lander, they didn't change the silicon design like for the 10 years of development they did to get the lunar lander up there, right? Because they froze the computer technology, the hardware early, which is the correct move, by the way, right? Because if you run into a hardware bug up in space, you're screwed. If you run into a software bug, especially with a simple system like that, and in fact they did, you can get around it by knowing enough math. You don't need the computer, right? But if you run into a hardware bug, all the math in the world is not going to help you. Like the hardware is going to do what it's going to do. So the thing to get right, the place to put the velocity is in the software, but you can put too much velocity in the software and then it's useless again, right? Because you're just introducing bugs. So there's a place for velocity, right? But you have to know what you're doing. And all of this centers around good management. And good management requires good structure. And good structure requires less postmodern hermeneutics of suspicion or something, right? Where we're more trusting of structures to be imperfect, but way better than no structure. And that's agile in a jar, right? Agile is no structure. We don't want any management at all. That's how it was designed. That's what it was purposed to do, right? And that may work for your organization, maybe, but I don't think so. It almost no organizations have no management whatsoever like they did. Because they were a startup.
So we started talking about error correction, and so for example, with Starlink, you can get your like your vehicle into space and get your prototype. Maybe I like the POC. I jokingly call it POC. You know, a lot of people call it a proof of concept, but I like to call it a
Right.
piece of crap. And
Yep.
but you get your POC live, and then you can start getting your feedback, and then you can start getting these rapid updates and start enhancing features and whatnot. So
Right.
it's a,
Right.
so
But
that that
that's a bad model, actually, because the purpose of a proof of concept is to prove that the underlying technology idea, the underlying architecture from the designer is not wrong. Right. And
right.
then what you're supposed to do is throw the POC out and
I
build
agree.
it correctly from scratch.
I
And
agree.
software industry used to do that all the time, and it was beautiful because they'd come up with really high quality software.
Yeah.
Because look, when people don't understand, when you're dealing with a software designer, right, a software architect who's an actual software architect who actually knows what they're doing, and the odds that you've ever met one of these people are vanishingly small because they're extremely rare, actually, as it turns out. But sometimes
Shout
they
out
come
Mike
up with,
Jones. I know him. I know
well,
a few. I know a few.
there are a couple out there,
Yeah.
but you know, they sometimes come up with really bad ideas that don't work because they're people, and people sometimes come up with really bad ideas that don't work. And you don't know that their idea is infeasible or won't work or can't be implemented or requires way too much other stuff to be profitable, because that happens too.
Yeah.
Like
There's a
almost anything's possible, but most things aren't profitable, right?
so that
Or aren't worth it.
I think you're talking about the unknown unknowns. That's in the there's
Well,
Black Swans. I think that's from
Well, I
Taleb.
mean,
It's like
all of that factors into it. But look, at the end of the day, I can sit here and I can say, well, look, I can design a system that will work faster than Twitter, right? And deliver twice as many characters. I can make that statement. Now, I might even be able to pull that off, but that's because this is a different situation. But if I give that idea to somebody else, the odds that they could actually do that are basically zero, right? And
right.
so, is that because my idea is terrible? Because it might be. I mean, it might be. There could be things in Twitter that make it very, very fast. I don't actually. I tend to believe not, because I'm one of the things I do that I specialize in is performance engineering, and so I actually do stuff like this to
Yeah.
companies. I walk in and tune their performance, and then suddenly they're not. The last startup I did this for, they spent 45% less on their AWS bill, right?
Right.
And most companies don't care about that, by the way. So it's a very bad industry to be in. But it was it was useful for them. But it might be that that's a crazy idea and it can't be done. Like maybe Twitter is as fast as you can possibly send out that kind of data. That's possible. The only way to know is to do a proof of concept and find out. And then whatever proof of concept you do is supposed to prove the concept at a scale at which you're not operating, right? And so maybe you have to do two. One, to prove that the underlying idea is good, and the other one to prove that it scales to 1 million users or 2 million users or 1 billion users or whatever, right? So there might be multiple POCs that have to happen. And in the old days, this is how they designed software. I've read whole case studies about this. This definitely used to happen. And we don't do anything like that anymore. We just
Yeah.
start coding with a rapid application development and try to iterate over our mistakes. The problem is there isn't good error correction there, because some of the errors, as I said earlier, occur at scale, and you
Right.
made them already in the design, and you can't make up for a design error by coding out of it. You have to blow up the software and redesign it and start over.
So this is where um, I think I'm the pragmatic programmer, and so for example, you can start off with you can use like a file storage for your database, and you can build an adapter, and then as you scale, you can then interface with a SQL database instead of a file storage. So
Mhm.
the key there is that, well, I would say there's a way to write your code so that um, you are as prepared as possible for scaling without having to invest into the scaling initially, right? So
Right.
there's like
Well,
you can even choose languages, and you can choose coding styles. Like I've been reading about, for example, pure functions
mhm.
and uh, uh, function was it functional languages instead of object
Functional
oriented
programming.
programming,
Yeah.
because you basically can you try to avoid state, so then you can be 100% confident that your functions all given a certain amount of input is always going to have the same amount of
Yeah.
output. So
Yeah.
there are these techniques that we're arriving at where we can begin to get more predictability in the systems that we design, and do it in such a way that as we grow, the amount of pain that we have to pay off decreases. So I mean, we are getting better at this.
Well, that's the claim, Gavin. That's the claim.
Okay.
It's wrong. It's wrong.
Okay.
I've seen it. I've seen Haskell projects, and Haskell's a wonderful language. Not saying don't program in Haskell, but like the Haskell core libraries have bugs. So there go your function side effects right off the bat, right? I mean, the bug that I found, we were running a Couchbase at the time at the startup actually that I improved the performance of, and it turns out that there was a memory leak in the thing that gets IP addresses, which is a library inside of Haskell. Like there's no way around it except not to use Haskell for that piece of the code.
Right.
And look, good software engineering used to involve software that was programmed in multiple languages, not one. Right? And almost nobody does that. And that's the right way to do good code. And the problem is you can't use a language to solve a problem where your engineer isn't smart enough to solve the problem they're trying to solve. Because if you just don't understand the core principles and the problems you're trying to get around, all you're doing is creating them differently in the language. Like I said before, I've got a piece of Java software that's allocating 5 gigabytes of memory to read a 100 meg file. What is that all about? How did this happen? It's a very high level language. It should be able to handle memory allocation. It just that if you program it incorrectly, you will break it. It does not matter how good the programming language is. It makes no difference if the programmer isn't up to the task of understanding the core concepts. And it's a lot of core concepts that you have to understand about memory allocation. Then you will misallocate the memory. And in that case, this program was so complicated because there were so many libraries and frameworks and things to help them, that actually those things that were helping them were the things causing the memory over allocation.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get around these problems. The problem is we can't build enough competent programmers to meet the needs. No, we could allocate our programmers better and understand, better programmers versus worse programmers, but then we need a lot of management structure and a lot of understanding of how to interview programmers better. And this isn't a problem in the software industry. This is an industry problem in every industry. It's hard to know whether or not somebody is good at something, even if they've done it before. And it's very hard to know. And look, progress is progress, and you can always make things better, right? You can always fix a bad design, but ultimately you have to redesign it, and you can roll it out slowly, and that might look like iterating. But it's usually not, right? It's usually this slow thing and then a big cutover. And I've done many IT projects where we had bad IT design and we iterated over them. All large projects should have mixed language model. Absolutely, all of them. Because some languages are so good at some things that you're never going to beat that language for that thing. And that does help you with scaling. The thing that kills you with scaling is when you try to use like Java for everything, because Java is terrible at almost everything. And it's a messy language and it's hard to maintain. So I would say never use Java for anything. Although I've seen some good uses of Java. Front end products in particular that are embedded are great. Just program those in Java. That's fantastic, right? If your backend system, in that case, the backend system was programmed in assembly language and C, I believe. So the the Java was just an embedded app that ran in a browser to give you access to a disk array. It's fantastic design. It was beautiful. There were some problems because they tried to make it stateless. And guess what that did? It broke a bunch of things in the GUI. And it wasn't clear that was going to happen until later. They had to rewrite it. And eventually they did so that it was stateful. And once they rewrote it to be stateful, now all of a sudden you could have a back button on your GUI. And the back button actually worked. Because without state, you can't write a back button that works, unbeknownst to people. So stateless is not a good solution to any problem. You got to be careful where and when you put these things in. Look, I want to get back to sort of the bigger point. These are not software problems. These are not software industry problems. These are problems in our culture where we're denying the things that worked for years in some cases, and we're trying to get away from structure, and we don't want leaders telling us what to do, and we don't want authorities, manipulating our leaders. But we need all that stuff. We just need to do a better job at it. And we're not going to do a better job at it if every time it goes bad, we say, tear it down and destroy it, right? Or we're going to do agile instead and screw this. That's not going to make it better, right? What makes it better is participating with it and improving it with our skills when we can, and having a little humility about that process, because maybe we're wrong. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I get on a new project, I try to learn as much as I can about what they're doing, because how you implement this stuff matters more than anything else. Like, I can make an agile project successful. That's not hard for me to do. I have a bunch of tools to fix the problems. It's not the same for every shop, though, so I can't just whip out my Swiss Army knife, grab the blade, and start cutting. It takes a lot of analysis to figure out what are the broken parts, because some things in agile work perfectly well for certain teams at certain scales, and some things will never work at any scale, and some things will never work for this particular team. So you have to know that, you have to have some experience with it, and you have to be able to differentiate and do that analysis work. And it's very hard work, although sometimes it can be done very quickly. And then, moving the team into that is a whole different thing, because now you've got to slowly move the team and get them used to, well, we're going to change this week, and we're going to keep it going for a while. Make sure you're comfortable with the change, and we're going to make the next change. Because at the end of the day, I can give you the perfect way to build software for any given project at any given scale. That's not hard for me. I can do that pretty much like in my sleep, because I've been doing it so long. But if it doesn't work for the team, it won't work. Like, there isn't some objective software standard you can use. It has to work for the team, and they have to be comfortable with it, or they won't do it. And maybe they can't do it. Like, that might be a thing, a gap you can't bridge. And we need to have appreciation for that.
So there's a part of me that's like, I want to call your bluff. Like, I want to say, let's go through your Twitter design. That's it. So I want to, but I at the same time, I realized that can take a long time. So that would be like the first question is, how long would it take to go through your Twitter design, that you had alluded to, right? Like, how long would that take, and what would that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, you got to lay out requirements first, right? And if performance is in that case, performance was one of the requirements, right? I want something faster than Twitter, right? That was the primary requirement. And requirements compete, so you have to put them in a priority order.
And when you say faster, like, what do you mean? Like, what is the slowness that I'm experiencing on Twitter that would go away?
You'd have to define what that means, right? Right. So you have to go through this whole process in architecture, in software architecture in particular, or systems architecture. They're very much the same, right? You have to go through this process of understanding and defining terms very carefully, right? And that's generally referred to as ontology. And there's an ontology room on Clubhouse that I attend quite frequently on Friday evenings. It's usually around 8:30 or 9 Eastern on Fridays for some reason, because I guess the ontology folks have no life whatsoever. And it's quite delightful. I mean, I really enjoy it. They're recorded. There's replays of them that it's been going for more than a year, almost every week. So there's quite a few of them. So they talk a lot about this, right? Ontology is the way that you solve some of these problems, and I agree with them. But it takes a lot of upfront definition. It's an 80% design and 20% coding rule sort of a thing. But it solves a lot of problems that you'll run into otherwise. And we talk about those problems in that room quite frequently. And so if you want to hear some examples, the last a few of them, there are certainly tons of examples in there. I've used some examples from my world, and they've used some examples from their world, especially in finance, which is something I have some familiarity with as well. When you're doing a design, you have to break things down into very small parts and figure out exactly what you mean when you say fast, right? Or performant, or faster than, right? How, why, right? Is that useful? Now, I don't think a faster than Twitter design is useful. I was using that as an off the head sort of thing, right? Like, if you wanted to talk about, say, better designs, you talk about something like Discord, right? Where the design is terrible. They gave no thought to it, right? You could look at Clubhouse itself and say, there's all these features missing out of Clubhouse that would make Clubhouse a better place to create content. Maybe they don't care about that, right? And that's the problem. A lot of times, the business alignment and the software alignment are not anywhere near each other. And so you have a mismatch, right? And the software engineers go and write this great software that does exactly what they think it should do. And maybe they're not wrong about that, but maybe it doesn't do any of what the customer wants. And maybe the vision of the management team was different too. And you know what you can't solve that with? You cannot solve that with Agile. And it makes it seem like you can, but actually you cannot solve that with Agile. Agile may make some of that better at some level, but you can't solve it with Agile.
What is it?
You do solve
say
it with
that one
good
more
analysis.
time. What is it you can't solve with Agile?
The gap between what customers actually need, what management thinks that people should be building, and what software engineers actually build.
Yeah, yeah. There's a concept I've run across called jobs to be done framework, and so it's like the picture that comes to mind is Mario with a fireball. I think I read an article about that, and the question, that you end up with a product manager who's like saying, Mario needs this firepower plant, but really the job to be done is to kill the Goomba with a fireball, right? Or to or to take out the Goomba. So I think I get what you're saying about the problem with Agile. There's other pieces that you have to bring into the decision making process in order to figure out your design.
Right.
What you need to do.
Design is the process of unification. Unification of concerns, unification of goals, unification of implementation. That's what design actually is, right? And we're living in this postmodern framework, whether we realize it or not. People are far more postmodern just in their everyday life than they can possibly understand normally, right? We're just very postmodern. And so the side effect of that is that we tend to look at things that are built and reverse engineer how they were built, almost certainly incorrectly, because we almost never know, right? And then we make assumptions about what those people were seeing when they were building it, and then we try to emulate that. And that is an incorrect way to look at the world. The world doesn't work that way. That's a projection from the future into the past, right? Because we're looking back at something in the past to derive, well, how did they go about this, right? But then when you listen, and there are YouTubes about this, there was one, I think it's Dirty Dog was the gaming company, but they were talking about the Sega Genesis, I think it was, back in the day, and how it was one of the gaming platforms and how they optimized the gaming platform. Oh no, it was Sony PlayStation. I mean, they did both, but the Sony PlayStation one was more interesting. They basically realized that the library that Sony released was full of bugs, and so they didn't use it. That was their solution. Because they had the specs of the processor, they used the processor commands at the assembly language layer instead of using the library that came with the developer kit. And then they were able to do all kinds of things that no other gaming company was able to do. And it was just two guys, actually, right? And you see this a lot, right? You get these big software teams trying to solve a problem. And when I go into these organizations, I try to find who are the two guys that are actually running everything. Or maybe it's one guy, because that's what actually happens. Successful teams have one guy that's doing 90% of the work, right? And that's fine. Like, that's just the way of the world. It's Pareto principle all over again. But the process of design is the process of unification, getting everybody on the same page. And the process we normally go through in the process of Agile is splitting everything up. They're just opposite processes, and you need them both. Like, I'm not saying throw out Agile, right? But I am saying that Agile has a place, and it's not all the way up the stack. You cannot do design work with Agile, and you cannot solve the gap problem between what clients actually need, what they say they need, what software engineers here to build, what they build, and what management thinks is happening. Those are lots of gaps. They're not 3 gaps. There's way more than 3 gaps. There's like 9 gaps there. And you can't solve that with Agile. It's not solvable. Agile helps move some things over in some cases, absolutely, but it doesn't solve that problem. What solves that problem is good design. And we're just kind of throwing out these things because we think, well, we know how they work because there was a political person and they made a decision, and that didn't happen, right? I'm not saying that those events didn't occur, but that's not what makes things happen, because you're not looking at all the times that the political person said something else and nobody did anything and nothing happened, right? So there's more to it than that, right? There's just a big chain of causality that happens in the world.
The risk of a design is that it does take a lot of time, and that you put in all of the effort, time, money, and at the end of the day, you create something that nobody wants, right? That's the reason. Yeah, I mean,
that's not the design's fault ever.
Right.
Design is serving a set of requirements that is set by the management team. And this is why the management team matters, right? The person with the vision matters. And if the person with the vision doesn't have the right vision. So suppose they say, look, what people, and this happened. So I'll just tell you the story. So my buddy came to me one day. My buddy's very, very smart. He's a PhD from MIT. Okay. And he's one of the brightest people I've ever met in my life. And he's still like that. He's ridiculously smart. He knows all kinds of stupid things. It's just insane. Right. So he's got this PhD from MIT and he comes to me and he's working on wearables. This is years and years ago. Wearables were coming into fashion. And he says, I think I can design a camera that's wearable. But he says, I think the real market is in cell phones because, as everybody knows, cell phone camera quality is terrible, and everybody wants a better cell phone camera. That was his base assumption. And then he said, this is a huge market because you can put those cell phone cameras in all the cell phones. And so basically your market is, and he had the number off the top of his head of how many cell phones were sold every year. So basically that's your market. Okay. There are so many problems with that. And he's just wrong about everything, basically. Right. First of all, and I had worked at the cell phone company before this, a company that actually made cell phones. The way it works is they ain't giving away their good stuff. If Apple gets a better camera vendor for their cameras, they're not letting that vendor sell to any other provider ever, right? They're going to lock them in with a contract. So you never have the whole cell phone market in hardware. That doesn't happen. And there's some exceptions, right? The chip manufacturers have sway. So because they're leading the way in their tech, so they can, but the people that are making custom sensors, no, you get locked into a vendor. So you never have 100% of the market. And the cell phone market at that time was pretty well splintered because Nokia was in the market and a couple of other, Motorola was still in the market. Right now, it's much smaller market. So he would have gotten one of those companies, right? He wouldn't have gotten all of them. The other problem is no user at the time, and I would argue even now, except crazy people like me who are actually into photography, actually cares about the quality of their pictures because they're taking pictures of them going and sending them to their friends with a beer in their hand. That's what they're doing. And those pictures are getting immediately deleted. They're getting looked at and deleted. Nobody cared about the quality. Literally nobody. It just wasn't a thing. So he's just making an assumption that this market existed. Now, had he the money, and he didn't at the time, he could have embarked on that project and come up with a perfectly good design. And that design would have been awesome because he's really smart and he's excellent at design work. I know this for a fact. I've worked with him before, right? And so that product would have failed. And you could blame the design phase, but it's not. It was the original goal of the project was silly, right? And it was just misinformed. It was a bunch of bad assumptions. That's not the fault of the designers or the design. The design might have been perfect. And this happens all the time in the industry. It happens in every industry. Perfectly designed product, and some people go, oh, it's the wrong time to market. Maybe, right? Oh, the market wasn't ready. Well, that means you didn't look for a need. You just built a cool product. And software engineers do that themselves, right? They'll go in and they'll go, well, I know a cool way to solve this problem. Yeah, nobody cares about your cool way to solve the problem, guy. What they care about is whether or not things work the way that the customer needs them to work. And a lot of times solving things in the coolest possible way for the software engineer causes a bug for the client. I see this all the time. The end customer goes, well, this is great, but I needed to do this. And the software engineer is like, and I've been in these meetings, like I've sat in these meetings with these guys, and I love software engineers, and I'm a software engineer. I know 8 programming languages, so not, but the software engineer is like, no, it works this way. You need to use it this way. And the customer is like, no, I'm never going to do that ever, right? But the software engineer is so caught up in the cool solution that they're not delivering the product that the client needs. And it happens all the time, and it happens in every industry. It's not just software.
Right. So goals are important.
Or having the right goals. And look, again, there's got to be a humility. People make mistakes. Marketing people doing marketing research screw it up. Managers implementing projects screw it up. Designers designing things screw it up. It's not the common case with good people, for sure, but it happens. And it happens pretty frequently because people are constantly building stuff. And you don't really, the great hubris that we have is that we do this thing called sample biasing. What do we sample? We sample success, right? Why is Elon Musk successful? I don't know. Let's look at all his successful projects. What about all the projects he failed to do? Because there's a lot of them. There's way more failures in Elon Musk's portfolio than successes, and nobody ever talks about those. And why were they failures? And I'm not claiming I can know or that you can do an analysis or that somebody hasn't and been right about it. I have no idea, but they're there. I know some of them. I know they're there, right? And that's true for everybody. But we're looking at success and trying to reverse engineer it. and then assuming a bunch of things. And, I try to tell people the reason why you're not as successful as Elon Musk is because you won't sleep under your desk, for one thing. If you won't even do that, why would you expect to be as successful as Elon Musk? And a lot of people, like, that shakes them out of their ridiculousness. It's like, you're not trying to emulate Elon Musk. You're picking and choosing what things you think Elon Musk does that are good and saying, I can do that. Therefore, I'm worth $200 billion or $400 billion or $2 trillion because I'm better at it than Elon Musk. You won't even sleep under your desk. Come on, you got to be able to do all the and look, you're probably not Elon Musk. And what worked for him probably won't work for you because you're different people and you're in different circumstances and you're starting from different places, right? And people get caught up. Well, Bill Gates was successful this way. Bill Gates got lucky and formed a monopoly, right? Like, it didn't, like, following in his footsteps is folly, right? And Bill Gates is a brilliant software engineer, by the way, when it comes to programming basic. Top notch, no question. And I always said that. He's a terrible business person. He made the worst predictions about the computer industry ever. They're all written down. You can look at them. He was wrong about all of them, right? And that's the problem, is that we're following in these templates that don't even exist, of these successes that didn't happen the way we think they happened.
I like this comment from Griswold Grimm, the guy who prefers asynchronous communication and the fastest talker in the corner.
Maybe.
It's interesting. You're advocating for the planning phase, perhaps patience, these kinds of things.
Patience, humility, right? And the fact that, look, you have to know you're going to do things wrong.
Griswold, how many minutes ago did you speak, Gavin? So I'm gonna practice learning how to host these. I think if Jacob had been here, Jacob would have cut you off at some point, and maybe I'll have to get better at hosting.
I'll openly criticize Jacob's hosting right now. I don't think it stays on topic, and I love Jacob, but I think you're hosting a much better stream than he would anyway. But yeah, look, if you want to interrupt, right ahead.
Yeah, I am letting you talk, so that there might be some bias there as well, right?
Yeah, look, yeah, right. Again, the goal of the conversation is not to have a Jacob-style conversation. The goal of the conversation is, Gavin, you wanted to learn some stuff from me, and we happen to have software in common, which is kind of unfortunate in a way, because it's really easy for me to talk about software all day forever. That wouldn't bother me at all, right?
Well, you are saying a lot of things that I'm not just accepting as true. Like there's, and then it sounds like you do understand that a lot of the ideas that you have are context dependent. One thing that I like about software is this idea that you can actually embed knowledge into the software. So, for example, I worked on some software for an ALS clinic, and it was, I think we were essentially trying to create the process by which patients receive care, and embed that into the software and create the workflow in the software that corresponded with the workflow that the patient would receive the care. And so that's kind of the idea. Another idea would be that, I could learn how to cook the best hamburger, and then I could perhaps have a robot that receives a recipe for cooking the best hamburger, for example. So I like this idea of being able to take knowledge, whatever that is. Maybe it's that thing that develops over time as we do error correction and learn from our mistakes, and then somehow embed that in the software, so that, for example, hopefully that's the means by which the thing can scale. So you're talking, so the context of, for example, your ideas depend on what the context is, like, for example, the scale of the organization or the size of the organization. So but you can also embed that into the software as well. So, I mean, this is like when I'm talking about or thinking about error correction, when I'm trying to learn about error correction, I'm also trying to think about the process by which, for example, I hear you say that you disagree with John Vervaeke, right? And then it's like, well, how does the thing that you disagree with him about, whether it's true or false, I'm not sure, but how does that end up becoming the signal which John Vervaeke receives and ends up learning from in order to become a better human, assuming that what you have is true and is useful, right? So That's
right?
that's really like it's the problem that I've been really interested in because what I'm seeing, I'll say it again. Joe Rogan is telling people ignore the criticism. Meanwhile, it's like among all of the information, tons of it, most of it is going to be noise, but there's got to be some signals in there that would be very useful
Yeah,
for people. And we haven't figured out how to connect the useful information with the popular person who just can't deal with all that information. To Jacob's
right,
point earlier, because of we can be attacked with a DDoS attack, and so you
right.
can use you can use. There are these processes, there are these strategies, these technologies that I think can be used to
Mhm.
help solve this problem. And I see businesses doing it, but I haven't seen like um, sense makers doing it. I haven't seen people who are interested in sense making trying to
Right.
do it. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. It's interesting
Mhm.
that you have some respect in the Awakening for the Meaning crisis community. You have some knowledge about software and technology, and I imagine you have some kind of relationship with John Vervaeke. And so it's like
Yeah.
this is like to me. It's like there's an opportunity. For example, it's like but I don't
Yeah.
know how all those pieces can fit together into something that ends up working and being helpful for example, for John to accomplish his goals, right? Because ultimately it
Right.
comes down to goals, and that's how you determine what's signal and noise.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a lot wrapped up in there. I mean, look, early software, the scaling was through automation. And when you're scaling automation, you're scaling through time, not through numbers. Not through numbers of customers or something, right? Time allows you to scale through numbers of customers if you're flipping burgers automatically, and that's faster, then you can serve more people. And if you need to serve more people, that's great, right? But if you don't, then it's not useful, right? And so there's different types of scaling. And scaling through time by automation is very good use of software. Scaling by numbers is a different thing, whether it's customers, right, or amount of data. And then the problem with more information is that more information is a DDoS attack. More information is an attack. It's an assault because the more information you have to sort, the harder you have to work, the more you have to think about it,
But
right?
you
And
can use crowdsourcing and machine learning, for example, as two possible approaches, two possible strategies for handling large
oh,
amounts of information.
people say that, but who's determining what to do with all that information? I mean, look, look. I agree, we're doing that, and everything's getting worse. So there's a negative correlation here, right? Like people say, oh, the technology can solve this problem, and I say the trajectory of technology seems to correlate with the problem. It
So the
doesn't seem to be making things better, but it does seem as though it could be making things worse.
So I think that the profit seekers are using crowdsourcing and machine learning for their benefit to the detriment of mankind. But the sense makers, like the institutions for education, aren't doing it. Like that's what it
No,
seems to me.
no, I mean, I thoroughly disagree. I mean, I think the
Yeah.
one of the things that ruined the software industry was online software engineering training, the boot camps and all that nonsense, because they're disconnecting. So look, when I went to a high school where they happened to have a programming, class, and the thing that I did, because I had already been programming long before I went to high school, was I went around the class and helped everybody else with their projects. So the minute they gave us a list of projects, I just write them all, boom, 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 because it's very fast, soft, and look, it's easy. We were doing BASIC and Pascal and, simple languages. So this is all easy stuff, right? And they were all basic principles, and I had already been coding for years by then. So I already knew how to do all that stuff. The thing was, though, I was walking around the room helping everybody else in a room with other people in front of a keyboard, right? And what would happen is they'd go, "Oh, my stuff doesn't work." And I'd read it and I'd go, "Well, why the hell are you approaching the problem this way?" Right? In my
Mhm.
head, I'm like, "What the hell is he doing? Like, that's not how you solve this problem. You solve this problem this way." But then what I realized quickly was, but I'm just there to help them fix their problem their way. And so now I'm like, oh, so I'm just treating this as a different way, right? Because I don't want to move them into my way of fixing the problem, even though I think mine's better. And in some cases it wasn't. That's for freaking sure. Right. So I would help them fix their bugs. And if their design didn't work, I would help them run into the design problem quickly, right? Because
Right.
that's a proper use of Agile. Run into your design problems really fast through POCs and rapid application development before you start coding for your customers. That's a good use of Agile. Yes, run into your design problems fast, whether they're scaling problems or whatever. Run into those as quick as you can. That's what I would do. But then what happened was I learned all these other approaches to these problems that I already had solutions for. So now I've got 3, 4, 5 solutions to these problems. And then I'm starting to see, oh, this solution would be better in this situation. This solution would be better in this situation. But because of the way you learn programming in particular, but lots of things, there isn't a clear winner, right? Because again, most solutions are arbitrary, especially outside a larger goal. And so you need to be mindful of the goal. And the people being mindful of the goal, their management, right? And so when you have that, you can leverage anything. You can leverage data, you can leverage faster computing, right? You can leverage more compute, you can leverage anything when you have a structure that allows you to do leverage, okay? And anybody can do that. Like right now, anybody can write a competitor to Twitter. It takes very little effort, right? And they could take over Twitter in a heartbeat with a better algorithm in theory. They could, right? It might cost a little bit of money, but it wouldn't cost $1 million. And you could code it by yourself if you were a good enough software engineer, or if you could get enough volunteer software engineers. And I have seen people do this. This happens literally all the time. How many companies, software service companies, or any kind of company just walk into an investor and get $10 million and start a company? Very rare. Most companies don't start that way. They start with volunteer. Nobody's getting paid. People are doing it in their spare time. And that's the way they start, right? And so they don't start with money. That's not how most companies start. They start with good ideas and motivated, passionate people, right? And then the reason why these things tend to work is because the people in them want the goal, the larger aim, more than they care about the criticism. And one of the problems with Joe Rogan's formulation is that Joe Rogan talks about getting criticism and receiving it well all the time. He just doesn't classify it as criticism, to my earlier point. We need another word. What happens in comedy in particular is, and I've witnessed this personally in a room myself multiple times with comedians, so I can say something about it, and in Boston no less, because I used to live in Boston. So what would happen is they would talk about their stage sets with other comedians sometimes ahead of time, and then after they did their set, they'd come back with the other comedians and get feedback. It was just comedians talking to comedians. I mean, they kept trying to get me to go up to do a set. I'm like, I'm not prepared to do a set. I'm just here to watch and laugh and enjoy. You know, I'm just enjoying the open mic night. I'm not here to participate. But almost everybody else in the room was an aspiring comedian and was making jokes. But they're getting feedback from other people. That's criticism, technically, but they didn't see it that way. And Joe Rogan talks about getting criticism from his fellows all the time. He just doesn't couch it as criticism. So that's a different, that's a different way of approaching it.
So his basically his process, his algorithm. So he's got a goal of comedy, of trying to get better at comedy, and then he's developed this network of people that he trusts and he receives feedback from, and that helps him, for example, become a better comedian or even get better at doing his podcast.
That's what it looks like in hindsight, right?
Well,
but that's not, if you listen to his story, that's not what happened.
Okay.
That's not what happened at all, right? Usually, and I think this is true for him, although I don't remember all his story off the top of my head, he wants the attention, right? You want to entertain people, you want attention. So your goal is to entertain people. And then you stumble into, I don't know, well, some entertainers just get up and do comedy, and some comedy people go on to do different types of entertainment. And maybe that's a good way in the door. So he starts hanging out with, at the comedy club in Boston with, what's her name, Mitzi, I think, or whatever, right? And there's a community there, and he just enters the community humbly. And because he's being humble, he's accepting criticism, and that's helping him to learn and grow. And that's what's happening, right? This deconstruction after the fact is wrong. Like, he wasn't thinking that way at the time. I think people have very simple goals, and how they implement them is a little bit different, and it was funny because this came up last night. Somebody was talking about Spotify, and the story of Spotify is actually pretty interesting. If you haven't seen the story of Spotify, it's fascinating. A lot of people don't understand. Spotify pays pretty well. They pay artists pretty well. They pay artists better than anybody else, according to some measures. So they're not doing bad by the artist. Spotify started because one friend told another friend, I think that you could make the latency between the time you ask for a song and delivering a song down to some ridiculous number. I think it was 33 milliseconds or something stupid. And the engineer that he knew was like, no, I don't think that can be done. But then he went and figured out how to do it. Right? It's like, oh, okay. Right. And then look, a lot of things have to come together for Spotify to work, right? Including contracts with record companies and like there's all this business stuff. That's why you need to have respect for management, because that's what management handles, right? You're a lowly software engineer, you're a tiny cog in a big company, and that's a good thing, right? You don't want to do that work. You don't want to do the accounting, make sure the payroll gets paid. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do investor pitches. I don't want to do investor. I've done them before. They're terrible. I don't want to do them. Right. I'm working with a small company now, and the CEO does all the pitches.
That's
right?
what Grimgris was saying. It would be beneficial if the code monkeys were taught how to speak venture capital.
There is no venture capital language. Like that's the problem. And no, I mean, even people who aren't code monkeys, when you show them Shark Tank, miss all the messages in Shark Tank. Like literally all the messages. They don't actually understand what's happening in the show. And that's true of a lot of people. Like I just had this argument a couple of days ago with my CEO. He said, we need to break this down and make sure that everybody knows how long everything's going to take and how much dollars. And I said, if you pay me more money, I can develop software quicker. It's not a linear relationship. I can't double the size of the team and have the delivery date or anything, because that's not realistic. It doesn't scale linearly. But everybody knows more software engineers, past a certain point this stops working, but more software engineers get you the same quality software faster. Yeah, it does within a window. Sure. Right. So you can't tell an investor something like that. I'm not saying that you should start that way, of course, but you can't give them all the scenarios, and there's too many. And having people try to specialize in too many things makes them worse at all of them. So you don't want people to know venture capital and coding. That's not helpful. What you want is somebody as a special investor capitalist on your team. That's what you want. And then you want that team managed by a structure that everybody can agree upon that will be terrible and horribly tyrannical, but good enough to get the job done. And it's a job you can't do by yourself, because you need many, many specialists to run a business. You need a good accountant. I can do accounting. I can do accounting good enough to run a company. But you know what I can't do? I can't be the CEO of the company, be the accountant of the company, be the lead engineer, do all the non-lead engineer coding, right? And all the other stuff that comes with the company, including the management and planning and layout, project management, all at the same time. I have all those skills. I could do all of them individually, but I can't do them all at the same time anyway. So I need other people to do that. So there's no way around that. And the thing that mediates that allows people to cooperate together is structure. And that's what builds community. Communities build within structures, or sometimes they build the structures up inside of them. But all of this requires a humility. It requires a submission to structure. It requires a submission to the people in the structure who are going to implement the structure imperfectly and sometimes make mistakes. And it requires that you're humble about your own ability to implement the structure perfectly, right? All of these things are factors. And if you don't do that, all the criticism in the world, all of the feedback in the world, all of the careful talking in the world is not going to help you. So for example, to bring it back to what you were talking about, I've had a conversation with John Vervaeke about his 4Ps model, which I have some vehement disagreements on, right? Because there are some holes in it, some very obvious holes, in my opinion. It doesn't account for narrative. If narrative is important, it should account for narrative. It can't account for narrative, right? So
is narrative propositional though?
No, it's not. That's the problem. Narratives definitely not even a little bit propositional. Stories are propositional, but not narratives.
Okay. So what's the difference between
narratives are patterns? Narratives are templates, right? Or templates or patterns, right? That are revealed by stories. So you have 10 stories, they may reveal one or more, or maybe a part of a narrative, right? Because you can see that narrative structure in those stories.
So you're saying like a narrative would be like an archetype, and a story would be like an individual who might fall into an archetype.
I have a video on this actually on my channel on navigating patterns, right? Story, narrative, and archetype. Stories at the bottom, that's an implementation. Narrative is a template pattern, right? There's probably more than one of them. And many narratives point to archetypes, whether it's archetypal stories or archetypal characters, usually both, right? Archetypal patterns, there's archetypal patterns, right? That recur throughout narratives over time. So it's a three-tiered system. I like threes, I like triangles, right? And it is archetypes at the top, narratives in the middle, and stories at the bottom. You need lots of stories to figure out what the narratives, what narratives are. And roughly, stories that don't follow narratives are bad stories. That's how you know a bad story. It doesn't follow a narrative pattern correctly, or it breaks a narrative pattern. It's not a good story.
I
Right?
want you to continue with your story about John Vervaeke, but I do think that it does sound like these are types of proposition. Like it seemed like subcategories of something that could be a parent category.
No,
Could there?
Gavin, the problem is all communication is propositional. And we confuse the map for the territory. And then we think that because we can talk about it in language, that it must be propositional. But this is an error. This is one of the errors that everybody makes, including McGilchrist. Like, this is my criticism of McGilchrist's work, is that you're measuring on the way in and you're measuring on the way out. The problem is that the measurement alters the result, because when you measure on the way out, you have to use the same side of the brain. So it looks like things are going ping-ponging on your brain, but they're not. Right. They only ping pong when you have to communicate out the answer, because communication only uses one side of your brain, roughly speaking, right? At least in his model. And so, right, we make these map for territory errors all over the place. So my point to John Vervaeke, which I made with Manuel, at least a year and a half ago now, it's probably 2 years ago, right, was that there's a better way to think about this model. And the error correction were things like, he sent us at one point a list of his, quote, perennial problems in one of the books he was working on. And Manuel came back in 20 minutes and said, oh, there's a problem with this list. It's incomplete. And I know what the corrected answer is. Now, I was working on something else, right? He got the paper. He read it right away. He threw it in our model, right, which is slightly different than John's model. And not only came up with the fact that there was a missing piece, but figured out what the piece was. And I went, Manuel's pretty smart, but no one's that smart. So I said, Manuel, calm down, just relax, whatever. Look, I'll look at it in a minute, right? Because I was very skeptical, and I was very dismissive towards him too, right? And I can get away with that because Manuel and I have a pretty good relationship, which I think is healthy, right? It's a good sign of an intimate friendship. But when I looked, he was right. He plugged the thing that Vervaeke gave us into our model, and he said, nope, this is missing, and here's what's missing, and he did that in like 20 minutes. So our model is very powerful. So that's a good sign of error correction, right?
So, why is your model better?
Well, it's a model of information, not knowledge, because when John's talking about the 4 P's of knowledge, he's actually describing information, is my argument. What you store in your memory is information. You don't store knowledge in your memory. That's crazy. Knowledge has to be more flexible than that, right? Because it has to change. Right? Information doesn't change, at least as readily. Right, it kind of sits there like, oh, this happened to me. Okay, that's in your memory. So that's one thing. The second thing is, he talks about perceptival, but if you think about it, perception has to happen first, right? Because perception is the process of putting data or signals, because I use a signaling model, in formation. In other words, the process of making signals into information or putting them in formation requires a perspective, right? And your perspective modifies as you get signals, right? Sure, it's fungible. So it has to happen before knowledge or even before information. And so the perspectival's at the bottom, and we replaced it with the poetic. We used to call it the parabolic, but now we call it the poetic, right? And so that allows you to describe narrative, because narrative is part of the poetic. Stories are propositional, narrative poetic, right? So you've got the two differences right there, right? One is about the pattern, the navigation, that's the narrative, right? And the other is about the instance, right? Or what happened, right? A report on what happened, right? And so reports on what happened are stories. Like, I went to the store and here's what happened at the store, right? This happened to me and that happened to me and this happened to the other person and this is what I saw happen, right? But those sorts of ideas, well, I go to the store every week to buy groceries. That's a narrative, right? And you can fit liturgy into there. You can't fit liturgy into John's model very easily. I mean, there are ways to do it, but it's very clumsy, right? And so the importance of having a correct model and a corrective model are right there. And the error correction was using our model on John's data of perennial problems to validate our model while at the same time showing the error in his. Right. And we took this to him and he would hear none of it. And he admitted at the time that maybe that was him being egoic and that, that it could be. And he's very gracious. And he often says, we shouldn't go after people for having different ideas and different models. It's okay. They're not, and they're not incompatible, right? Ours is just an adjustment to his, roughly speaking. But he wasn't open to that criticism. He admitted he wasn't open to that criticism, and he didn't receive that criticism, even though it was given. And that's fine. I'm not worried about it. That's John's thing. And in order to have criticism be effective, you have to submit. And if you don't want to, then you're not going to get effective criticism. And that's fine. And it's the idea of submission or acceptance in that, you're probably incomplete, you're probably make mistakes, you're probably going to get it wrong, right? And you could benefit from having people look at it, even though they're going to get their criticism wrong occasionally, right? It's not a perfect process, but it also doesn't have to be. Like, I'm not going for perfection. I'm just trying to get better, right? And when you have that attitude of just trying to get better, you can have grace for other people screwing up their criticisms, right? Because look, I criticized Manuel. In that case, it was a poor criticism because he was right. He criticizes me, and sometimes his criticisms are complete garbage, right? And I'm not saying I always know when that's true either, right? Because sometimes there's all these problems, and they're not going away, and that's fine. I mean, one of the better things that Vervaeke talks about is perennial problems. There are perennial problems in the world. Things like grief are not going to get solved. You're not going to vanish grief through some method. It's not going to happen, right? It's just something you have to deal with from time to time, right? Hopefully, not too often, but you're probably not going to avoid it either. So there's a bunch of these types of problems, and we need to find a way to accept those problems and move on. And so it's not about solving, it's about acceptance. And acceptance is an important part of being in a structure, being in a community, right? Being part of a company, being part of any group, is the acceptance that there's going to be conflicts that are not resolvable, but also don't need to be resolved. Like, sometimes somebody can just have a different opinion from you, and you can both go eat a burger together and be happy. Like, there's no reason to fight about these things.
Yeah, there's sometimes there's a goal, and like it's clear that can be measurable, and then a criticism could be tested, and you could verify whether the measurement improved according to the goal. Like those, like that's a little different than the kinds of criticisms where it's not clear what the goal was and whether accepting the criticism will have an impact on the goal, right? So
exactly.
So yeah, I guess that was kind of my question is what is I don't even understand necessarily the goal of John Vervaeke's work compared with and the measurable goal compared with his model and your and Emmanuel's kind of model and the criticism of his model, and what would be the measurable outcome that would change if
right.
in relation to John Vervaeke's goal, if he were to accept
it's not measurable. Like, right. John Vervaeke's goal is specifically not measurable, right? Because his goal is one of quality. It's betterment. Betterment is just quality. It's not a 4 or a 6 that you can measure against, right? And we're living in this world where we're used to the tyranny of quantity, I call it, right? And there's Sevilla King and equality existence, right? It's like, quality. Yes, quality is important, but quality is also not measurable, actually. You can make it into something measurable, maybe, but you're going to lose something when you do that. And that's, these are trade-offs. And it's like, I just want to get better. I don't want to be the perfect person. That's not my goal. Like, my goal is not to say, if I don't be the perfect person, right? Because perfection is hard to define, and perfection on what means and who's defining it, right? This is crazy. But I do want to be better, right? And so, there's a way in which you can look at Vervaeke's project and see the science in it, because really what he's doing is he's looking back at something like Christianity, and he's carved it up in a postmodern fashion and said, well, there's the religion that's not a religion, and then there's ritual, which is separate, right? And then there's practices, which are separate, right? And then there's, ways of having dialogos, which is separate. And then there's steal the culture, which is separate, right? But I would argue you've just carved up Christianity in that case. And that's fine. I don't think it's a valid thing to do, right? The art of design, as I mentioned earlier, is the art of getting everything together into one place so that it's understandable by the people interacting with it, so that they know their role. Because when you're being agile and fast, you don't necessarily know what your role is, and you won't necessarily interact in your role in a reasonable fashion. You'll just sit there and try to do what you do best. And that's good, right? But you're optimizing for yourself. You're not optimizing for the group, for the organization. And maybe you can't because you don't know what the ultimate goal is, right? And look, Agile tries to fix that by putting the developers in touch with the customers, with the end users, by using stories. And that, as I've seen that meet with various degrees of success and mostly failure, though, right? Because business guys don't know how to write good stories, and engineers don't know how to translate requirements by themselves into other things, right? You're better off actually having a mediator for that. This is the way they used to do software. Again, right? There were more people involved. It was a longer process, but it produced more quality code with fewer bugs. And you could argue, oh, bugs are measurable. Not a lot of bugs are measurable. Like, how do you measure a usability bug that loses you a bunch of customers? How do you even know that ever happened? You don't know. There's no way to measure that. You can guess. You can look at things that might indicate that, but you can't actually measure that. Or how do you know that your UI design is so terrible that people look at it and then abandon it immediately and never buy your product? You don't know. And grocery stores run into this. You don't know what actually goes on the end caps, right? They're trying things out and getting them wrong and trying other things and trying to measure stuff. But what's the quality? And how does that affect things? And I don't think there are answers to these problems necessarily, right? I'm just saying these are the sorts of considerations that we've moved away from in the tyranny of quantity, and we're trying to measure everything. And we need to move back to more balanced approach to quality and how things feel and how we intuit them to be, and how beautiful they are, how good they are, right? How true they are. And truthful is how true can I participate with them, right? Truth can be a proposition, right? But propositional truth is lame and sort of flat. I want to know if I can stay true to the mission in the company that I'm in. Can I stay true to the software that I'm writing? Can I stay true to the shopping experience in how I set up my grocery store, right? Can I stay true to my customer base when I design my UI? Can I stay true to these things, right? There's the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? And we need to re-inject the three transcendentals into what we're doing, because that's re-enchanting the world, right? Re-enchanting the world for somebody, because the world's already enchanted, they just don't see it, is all about adding in the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? It's all about adding in quality and having those qualities permeate more of the world.
I'm gonna show this one. This little corner 24/7 chat stream is this much closer to becoming reality. So yeah. I think it's a interesting project. So, and I'm hoping to be here kind of regularly. I'm planning on being here on Monday nights. But hopefully there'll be, and if anyone else is doing it, maybe I'll just join them. So, but yeah, I do feel like I'm getting a better sense of your perspective, right? So, the idea, the upholding of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Like it sounds like, and you're stressing quality or in balance with quantity. And then it seems like you have an appreciation for like kind of some traditional approaches. Maybe, and it sounds like you even favor traditional approaches more so than some of the newer approaches. But yeah, I think this this kind of interaction that we're doing and learning about someone else's perspective is good. Practicing listening, practicing having empathy. And then I say all that. There's a project that I've been meeting with this guy from Tasmania on Friday mornings for like over a year, and he has this idea for this huge tower between 300 to 1,000 meters tall that can extract water out of the air and provide a reliable supply of water for a city of like up to 100,000 people. And we entered into like the X Prize trying to win. And we felt like we got ignored, right? But we went through we got certified as like a qualified contestant. But
Good.
we we didn't like pitch the idea appropriately is kind of the feedback we got. We didn't get any
Pitching's hard.
experts. We didn't get any experts to actually look at the underlying physics. Now we did reach out to our own experts, but we didn't get experts within the X Prize to actually look. So, I'm
Right.
I'm
Well, that's
so this is
cooperation.
well there's this. I realize like the pitch is this qualitative thing. The actually being able to have a engineering solution to provide clean water for everyone on Earth, if we can scale it out, that's more of a quantitative that does have an
Right.
impact on the quality of life. It raises an opportunity for everyone. So I've got that kind of thing in the back of my mind. So when you're talking about the good, the true, and the beautiful, I've also got this kind of engineering project where I'm thinking, man, I wish we could figure out a way to get experts to prove that this thing does not work. And if it does work, it could potentially be a really nice project to to see come into existence. So
Right.
so yeah, that's so like my priorities and my goals are different, right? And they're actually
Mhm.
are measurable. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with my perspective. So I'm listening to your perspective, and it's
Right.
just we kind of have
But
a very different perspective. And
but what did you miss in that? You missed the quality that they're looking for in the contestants is people who cooperate with the board. Like that's what you missed, right? They didn't want you to only rely on external experts. They wanted you to cooperate with them and rely on their experts too, right? They wanted to be able to have the opportunity to help you with your design. And one of the problems, you can call me a traditionalist or whatever. One of the problems is that we see problems with, we'll say, older structures, and we go, you know what? This is a problem, and I know how to fix it. No, you don't. No, you don't. Almost never, right? Maybe someone does, but not you. Almost certainly not you, right? And they tried to improve things and improve things and improve things and improve things, and it's like all they really did was break down the structure that worked and replace it with something that didn't work, and nobody noticed. Except you can notice. You can do what Jonathan Blow suggests and start looking at your electronic devices and tell me how many don't have bugs. Because for him, I think it was zero. And for me, it's definitely zero. And I can point to all the bugs and I can probably tell you approximately what causes them. And if you show me the code base, I bet you I can point out where the code is broken, right? Or where to look for the broken code, because that's what I do for a living. But not many people can do stuff like that. And you have to look for problems to know that they're problems, because if you don't notice, they just sneak up on you and they wipe you out like that. And this is what happens in software all the time, is that they build this stuff and it doesn't scale, and then kaboom, that's the end of their project and their funding goes away, and there's nothing left, right? Or they've got perfect technology. I worked for a startup, great technology. I improved them. I got dropped their expenses by 45%, which is pretty significant, right? Small changes too. 1% performance increase, right? Stabilize the system, and because you're doing a million hits a minute or whatever, drops the expenses by 45%. So a small 1% change can make a big difference. They lost their customers. It had nothing to do with the software team. It wasn't my fault. I was doing infrastructure. It wasn't the software engineer's fault. He was writing the software. The software was working great. It was super stable by that point. Like, I stabilized the whole environment. That thing never going down again. It was totally self-healing. We fixed all the bugs in Couchbase. It was great. But the marketing team wasn't paying attention, and we lost the cooperation of the customers, and we lost our biggest customer. And then that company closed like 3 months later. They fired everybody. They fired me first, and then they fired everybody else. And then, yeah, and it was too, and they didn't need me anymore to some extent. So, I mean, I could have really contributed had they grown, but they weren't going to grow at that point anyway. So, fair enough. I should have done that. I shouldn't have done that as a full time. I should have done that as a contract. Who knew? But these, assuming that you can just improve upon things, or assuming that you understand what the problem really is, right? Oh, the software wasn't good enough. No, our software was solid, but we lost customers because companies are complex.
right.
And when you're a software engineer, Gavin, what things do you see as problems in a company? I bet they're not with the accounting department or with the marketing department or with the management, although you may complain about some of those, and some of those things you're complaining about may not be the problems you think they are, right? Just read the 10-day MBA by Steven Silberger, right? It'll make you a better employee and it'll allow you to understand business better as an employee, right? There's a lot of things that you're going to look at as a software engineer and say, well, I got to fix that in software, when in fact your software change wouldn't have done any good at all because it's nothing to do with the software.
Right. Yeah, I've done reading on project management and helped out with that a little bit. So I'm not the engineer that wants. Well, I used to be, but I'm not the engineer who wants to build the thing. Like I'm actually cool with building nothing and maybe finding something that already exists. So, yeah, but I definitely see that as a pattern that a lot of software engineers, they get very excited about building something new, whether or not the customer wants it and whether or not it's good for the company. But I feel like, yeah, I think your point with relation to the, I shared a link, the convective heat engine, is that, yeah, the pitch that was probably missing something about quality. I guess there's a part of me that, this is why I'm reading books like How to Win Friends and Influence People and Never Split the Difference, is because I know that I'm not good at that part of interaction with other people. So it's something I'm working on. And then there's a part of me in the back of my head that wishes it didn't matter, right? That a good idea that can be measured would be able to stand on its own feet without trying to make it look very presentable, right? That look the right way so that it attracts the sheep, or the people who would conform in the Ash conformity experiments. So
right. But the problem is people don't measure things at all ever. For the most part, they never measure things. And so what happens, and this is where people get upset. It's like some slick talking guy comes along with this presentation and gives this cool presentation, and then they just give it money when in fact our software works and it's measurably better. But nobody cares about that because nobody's going to measure it, guy. So you're doing the wrong thing to the wrong audience, right?
Yeah, I tried to start my own business at one point with some partners, and like we built software, but it was and I mean, I learned I'm not actually good at selling software. Like I can create software, but selling software is a different skill.
Sales is a skill. Marketing is a different skill, right? There's different skills out there and you need them all. That's why you need these structures that we keep tearing down and saying, I don't want this tyrannical structure. No, you need that tyrannical structure.
Yeah, Ethan said How to Win Friends and Influence People is a dangerous book. Be careful.
There are some dangerous ideas in there for sure. Yeah, you have to interpret it very carefully.
Yeah, I think you have to, for example, be sincere in your listening and be sincere and wanting to be of service and be helpful. Like, and you want to make sure that you're not, being that parasite. You don't want to be doing the parasitic relationship with these skills. So.
Right. Well, and look, to know if you're engaged in a good project and engaged well in that project, situated well, we'll say true to the project, measure what you're sacrificing to be part of that project. Because if it's nothing or it's very little, then you're not being true to the project.
Right.
Like any project is going to require some of your time, energy, and attention. And that's going to take it away from any number of other things, not one other thing or two other things, any number of other things. This is the great, I have a video on binary thinking. This is the great problem of binary thinking. We keep thinking we're making a choice between two things, and that's probably never the case. I'm not going to say never. I'm going to say probably never, right? It's always a choice to do one thing or do any number of other things. And so when you give your time, energy, and attention to something, so what you're giving up for this project, which is very admirable, by the way, and I did a project like this. So I met with one guy I think it was Monday night or something right after work. We'd meet at this bar, and he'd always get the fish and chips, with malt vinegar, of course, because how else do you eat fish and chips? And I'd always get a ginger ale and the steak tips, right? And we did that for a year, and we developed a business that way. And it wasn't a software business either. We're both software engineers, ironically. Um, it wasn't a software business, but we developed the whole thing. And, I eventually went on to try to find funding for that, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very hard, right? And learned a lot back then, right? And yeah,
Right.
look, if you need expertise in how not to run a small business, please call me, because I've made a lot of mistakes and I know all kinds of things not to do. Right. But that's important. It's important information. But you're giving up one evening a week. For how many hours? That's a huge sacrifice to some extent, and that tells you that you're remaining true to the project. So that's great. That's wonderful.
I get up and meet him at either 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. So, and before work, that's the way I've been doing it.
You're a braver man than I, Gunga Din. No, thank you.
Right.
I can't even do that anymore. Yeah, but that's a way to know it if you're true to a project. And look, all the projects I've been involved in have not involved money, right? Except once where we bought a business, and then we were all spending our money on that, or giving resources. Like I was giving up a bunch of space in the basement with my computer lab, which I had like 50 machines down there, right? There's basically a way in which the sacrifice is the thing that makes it happen, not the money. The money comes later. And if you do the right sacrifice, you can probably get the money. And when you look at successful people, that's what you see. You see them doing things for free, getting free things done, right? And then coalescing that, and then everybody profits later, right? Or gets investment later. And there may be some small investments up front. Maybe you have to buy some cloud storage to start developing whatever it is. It doesn't really matter, right? But most of that stuff is done without the money. The money comes after the work. The hard work is done, and most of the sacrifice has been made. That's just the way it works. But if you're willing to make the sacrifice, your success rate will go up immediately in everything you do. And then you have to be humble. You have to realize if you want one successful project, you got to do 5 projects, buddy. You're not going to get a success with more than 1 project out of 5, most likely. And look, VCs know this. They invest. Their hit rate for the best VCs in the world typically is 1 in 10. They invest in 10 companies knowing 9 of them are going to fail.
Right.
And when they approach you, you're one of those 9.
Right.
Until proven otherwise, right? Because they're not investing in your stupid idea, because your idea is stupid and 100 people had it before. They're not investing in your product, even if you've built one, because your product is dumb and people have built it before. What they're investing in is whether or not you can implement and change to meet the customer needs. That's called pivoting now. We never had such a word back in the day, but now it's called pivoting. Can you pivot, right? Which just means when you find out your idea is stupid and the customers don't like it and they want it changed, can you make that change, right? And that's a question of implementation. That's what VCs are buying. They're not buying your dumbass idea.
Yeah,
they're not buying your stupid product. They're buying your implementation and whether or not you're a good enough team to do things like pivot, whether or not you can say, you know what, we were wrong and we need to make a change. And we're going to figure out what that change is, and then we're going to make it. That's what they're buying.
Right. Yeah, so I imagine there's some software that could be built to help, with sense making, for example, right? And so my experience is that, so with my small business, the amount of success it had was directly related to just having a customer base right off the bat and being able to adapt to what the customer needed. And so for me to, being able to get into the sense making software space would depend on having people who are trying to do sense making and who are willing to be guinea pigs for that sense making software and help give that feedback so that it can be shown whether it's useful or not, in accomplishing the goal.
Well, right? The problem is that, we live in a postmodern era, or error, as I would rather call it, right? Where people are very individualistic and they think that that's a good thing and they want to engage as an individual in the world. And my argument is you're not an individual in the world. That doesn't exist. And when you try to be, you just destroy everything for yourself and others because you're reliant on electricity, on the internet, on the sewage system, right? On house builders, right? On the knowledge of your elders and how to wire a house and have electricity go through it, right? On things like the invention of insulation, like you're relying on so much stuff. Unless you're living in the woods by
Right.
yourself making your own electricity, and some people are, but not many. And I don't
Right.
hear from them, and they don't complain. And you can be as individualistic as you want.
And
If you're
it's a,
hunting bears with a rock or whatever the hell you're doing, that's great. You go do that. I'm happy for you.
and
Right?
that's a good like, I think that's a good practice to recognize all of everything that goes into you're the world that's around you. I think I've seen
Right.
Chad do that in some of his
Yeah.
videos.
Yeah.
You can just go infinitely into appreciating where everything comes from, and you can look
Right.
at anything around you and see
Right.
all of the people and all throughout all time and space. They're all connected to
Right.
whatever's around you.
Right, right. But if you don't have that open attitude of gratitude, the attitude of gratitude, right? If you don't have that sense of grace, if you don't have that ability to say, you know what, I'm just this tiny stupid ant on this planet, this huge planet in this big world that preceded me, because a lot of the stuff, in fact, almost all the stuff in the world preceded you, um, then you won't be able to change, right? And so when somebody like Vervaeke, and this was a shock to me at Thunder Bay, he mentioned when I met him there, he said, "Oh yeah, I've been engaging with more people critiquing my work." And then the person he's engaging with is Nathan Ormond, who clearly hasn't read his work and isn't up to date even on his own criticism. Like he mentions parabolic. That was a shot at me. Fair enough, Nathan. You're all upset. I've never had a conversation with you of any substance, and you're all upset at me. A year and a half later, whatever it's been. I'm sorry to hear that. That's very sad for you, right? But it's called poetic. It's been poetic for quite a while, and you should have been up to date. There are legitimate criticisms that Nathan could have made that would have made his point, but he did not do that. And so John did not get good critical feedback, right? And John knows Manuel will be happy to criticize John's work. I would do it under protest, but I would do it if he asked, right? I wouldn't just do it like off the cuff. That's not appropriate. I love John. He did a lot of good work. We use his work. I think it's wonderful. He makes some great points that nobody else is making, right? I didn't jump into it. And people ask me at Thunder Bay, you're gonna criticize John on this and that and the other thing and all the things you talk about. I'm like, nope, I'm not gonna do any of that. If John asked me, maybe. I'm not even committing to that, right? But because he's not open to criticism, right? From me, which is fine. Right? He's not open to it. No software in the world is gonna fix that.
Yeah, it's ideally the software would help identify, for example, filter out trolls, right? So you had a test for identifying trolls. So theoretically, you could have a bot that would help identify trolls, right? So you could have a
I don't know that you
bot.
could. I
Oh, you
don't know
don't.
that you could. No,
Okay.
I mean, look, these tests are not things that you can quantify. Like you have to use the. Here's the test I gave to Nathan, right? I bet
Right.
everybody here will probably pass this test just fine. All I said is, everyone's a little riled up, and we have to remember when we're chatting in the text channels and talking to each other that we need to be kind to lesser creatures, right? That's all I said, right? Which you can sit there and say, Mark, that's you're setting a bait and a hook. Yeah, but you know what? Honest people don't think that's about them, right? In as a target, they think that's about them as somebody who can grow. So somebody who can grow and become a better person, right, is somebody who would interpret that to say, I could be kinder. It's not somebody who interprets that as an attack. If you interpreted that as an attack, you're an egoic, crazy person, right? You're probably narcissistic. You're very egoic. You've got some kind of problem. Like you're listening the wrong way around. Why? It's not about you. It wasn't about you. It wasn't about you in the negative. It was about you in the positive. We all must be kinder to the lesser creatures, whether they be ants or bees or squirrels or cats or dogs or children, right? Because children are lesser, or people who are not as smart as we are, or have a lesser IQ or less experience, or people who just want to know something from us that they don't know. We all need to be kinder to those people. That's all I'm saying. I'm not identifying you as being lesser, right? And so I don't know how you quantify that test and set it out, in a software way. And look, maybe that's a solvable problem. I don't think so. I don't think it would be reliably solvable, right? And there's many more tests I have like that, and usually I gen them up on the fly. I'm using a pattern. I'm not using, I'm not like, oh, I pull out this test when it's not like that, right? I have a pattern in my head of how to do these things, and that pattern emerges. I have a pattern in my head for jokes. So, and like you can say, oh, you make the era versus error joke all the time. Yeah, I do. But I use that pattern all over the place where I rewire words in people's heads on purpose to make a joke, right? To make them something more salient, right? They pay better attention, right? These are all tricks that I've been using for years. And like they're tricks to enhance conversation, to enhance listening, to give people a better time in listening, right? They're not meant to like be maliciously manipulating people to evil ends, but they could be used that way, right? And this is where people get caught up. This is why quantity is dangerous, because quantity doesn't speak to quality, right? The quantity of saying something doesn't tell you whether it's a good or bad statement. My statement that I made in that room on the voice chat was a negative statement to Nathan and a positive statement to everybody else. There's nothing I can do about that. There's a proposition that gets misinterpreted easily, but only by a certain quality of person, by the way. And that's why it works as a test.
I guess I've managed to say things in the past that have I don't. There's a way to say it, like brought out the demon or got people to become angry. It's like I do think there are phrases that can be said and presented such that it will cause people to kind of become belligerent. And I do think that a machine learning model could detect when people become angry as a result of a sentence.
It's not the phrase that's doing that. It's the framing that's doing that. I mean, this is where the postmoderns have a critique. Framing matters more than propositions, because you can change the meaning of propositions by changing the frame. And I have a video on this, right? Meaning in words, right? Words don't have meaning. Words have definitions. They don't have meaning. Meaning arises from the content, the definition, plus the context. And the context can be just the sentence they're in, the paragraph they're in, the culture they're in, right? So, for example, the phrase "keep your pecker up" means something very different in England from what it means in the US. In the US, that kind of sounds like something dirty. In England, it didn't used to mean that. I don't know what it means today, right? Or the term faggot. They still use the term faggot. You can't use the term faggot in the United States.
Right.
You'll get your ass handed to you. In England, it still means cigarette. Roughly speaking, it has other meanings too, other slang meanings. But like it's the same word. The meaning's not in the word. The meaning's in the context. And the context is cultural there. It's not even the paragraph or the sentence. It's actually a cultural meaning, context for the meaning. So you can't do that. You can't just take propositions and phrases. It's those phrases in context. There's all kinds of literally horrible things I say to Manuel, and he says to me, and we know the context is that we're just screwing with each other. Right? We don't take it seriously. Other people listen to it sometimes and they go, "How did you talk to that person that way? Oh my goodness!" It's like, yeah, because I know him and we're just screwing around, and we do this all the time.
So one thing, yeah, I don't imagine that I've ever like been a troll, and I think that part of that is because I've tended to have my name and my identity attached to the things that I say on the internet, for example. And so, Jacob he's into making sure that we have names, we have faces, and our cameras on, and so that in itself,
accountability. But that doesn't stop trolling. I mean, people troll under their own names all the time. They're well-known trolls. They don't care. I troll people occasionally. I don't care. I don't care if you know who I am. I'm still going to troll your ass if I think you deserve it. I'm still going to do it, and I might be wrong to do it, but not usually.
I mean, there's things I could say that could get me fired, for example, from my job, right?
Sure.
And so there's right. So you could be. I think Jacob is self-employed, and so he doesn't necessarily have that concern as much as I do.
Not in the same way. Yeah.
And then if you have wealth, you might not. I don't know who you're thinking about people who troll with their identity, but they're usually there's a situation in life that you can be in where I've heard Scott Adams call it FU money. There's different situations you can be where you can be a troll if you wanted to and not worry about revealing who you are.
No, but you can always do that. You just have to make it not about money. FU money probably comes from Nassim Taleb. He was the first person that I remember using it. His books are great. If you haven't read his book, just read all his books.
Yeah,
very interesting perspective.
I haven't, but I heard Chris, I forget his name, is one of the authors of Never Split the Difference. they created their company and called it the Black Swan Group, I think, and they got the Black Swan from Nassim Taleb. So
Yeah.
I should read. I should go through Nassim Taleb. I've been doing audiobooks while I'm driving, so I get less podcasts, but I feel like I might be getting better information from some of these authors.
No, audiobooks are really good. Yeah, Taleb stuff is really, really good. All of his books are excellent. And I mean, I read them as they came out. I was on to Taleb before Black Swan came out. Yeah. So I think the problem is that some trolls have nothing, and you can't take anything away from them, and so they don't care if they troll under their own name, right?
Cool.
Some people, and I mentioned this when I talked to Vanderclay, well over a year ago now. There, in the old days of the internet, trolling was a fun pastime that people did. Everybody knew that everybody else was trolling, and the purpose was to sharpen your argumentation skills, right? And so you would do silly things, literally silly things, like somebody would take the flat Earth position, and sometimes the person who took the flat Earth position was such a good debater. It's not really debate. I don't like that term, but it's the closest analog that I have. That they would be able to prove that the Earth was flat to the other person, and they'd have to concede and say, yes, I agree. Under your framework, the Earth is flat. I can't find a flaw in your argument. That happened. But that was a thing that we were doing to each other on purpose. And yeah, occasionally we did it to groups of people, but those people knew what we were doing. It wasn't a bad thing, and we were trolling, and it was classic trolling. And a lot of trolling is just about getting an emotional response out of somebody, right, and controlling them that way, rather than giving them a reasoned argument. Now, you may use a reasoned argument to get an emotional response. I do that to people all the freaking time, right? And sometimes I'm not trolling. Sometimes I'm just trying to help them. But it requires them getting emotionally invested in the argument in order to pay attention enough to what I'm trying to say to them, or the thing they're missing, right? So, for example, a lot of people, and we just had somebody recently on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis server. He was like, how do I get the richest guy in town to give me money to do blah, blah, blah? And I said, you don't need any of that. You just need to start going to do the work and telling people what you're doing. And then all of the sudden, right, if he's interested, he'll help fund it when he sees your progress is going too slowly. And he was like, really? And now the kid's got a job, and he's cleaning the house he lives in and doing all kinds of stuff. He's got all these plans all of a sudden. Before that, he was just smoking pot all day. I needed to get him emotionally invested in the idea that he didn't need money to get things whirling in the world, because you don't need money. Nothing starts with money. Everything starts with passion. Nothing starts with money. Money comes later, maybe. And all the money in the world won't get you your passion project done. Like, billionaires spend $1 billion and waste it all the time, because throwing money at something won't make things work. You can't pay people to care. You may be able to pay people to do things, but if they don't care about the things they do, they're not going to do a good enough job to get it over the hump.
So I'm going to bring the conversation back to the thing I want to focus on selfishly. Sure. So Vervaeke told you he listened to Nathan's criticism. So the thing is so Vervaeke could have a policy for how he receives criticism. And he could do something that the question in my mind is, how old is Nathan? What kind of knowledge does he have? And so you can begin to, you could say, is this his real name? And so you can begin to ask, well, I'm just saying, there's in your policy for how you receive feedback, you could say, I want to make sure you're a real person. And honestly, you could be so popular. It's like, well, you need to be old enough to qualify for president of the United States. You need to be 35 years old. You can create.
But that's ridiculous, because the best criticism comes from 4-year-olds sometimes, literally. So, because they see the world simply. And sometimes the best criticism is a simple one. You can't boil it down to these properties. You just cannot do that. It will not work.
So why don't 4-year-olds get to be president?
Well, because one good criticism is not worth 1,000 good decisions.
Right. So, well, that's what I'm. So
they're not equivalents.
So, to me, the person who is providing one signal among 1,000 noisy bits of non-information, of noise, right? That would be someone that you could legitimately ignore, compared to someone who's creating a lot more signals than noise.
You could, in theory, if you could determine any of these things, and you're assuming you can determine these things, but you can't. And that's really the problem. It's like, yes, in hindsight, you can determine that, but you can't determine that in the moment. It's not possible.
I mean, the thing is each individual can make up their own policy. And so you could say, well, you need to go
always do. Look, Vervaeke had a policy, right? Look, and look, Vanderklay had a policy. Vanderklay still wants Nathan back on the server, as far as I know, although he may have changed his mind because he sounded pretty angry in his last video, right? But the bottom line is he didn't have all the information, because had he talked to me, I would have said, no. Nathan is a bad faith actor. I can prove this, and I have the goods, and I have the witnesses. Somebody asked me in the comments thread of Vanderklay's video, they asked me flat out, are you sure that Nathan hears things that aren't said? And I'm like, yeah, actually. And I have 6 witnesses that happened.
And
okay,
he could change, right? And he could learn.
And this is the right. And then even if you have a system, you can't throw that person out forever. How do you redeem them? Well,
right.
Look, now this is awful. This is starting to look an awful lot like the Christian church now, right? Because the Christian church has a way to deal with all of these problems. They're perennial problems. They're not going away. You can't solve them. So how do you fix them? A church seems to have fixed all of these problems for you. So I would say you're trying to fix something that we already have a solution for, right? And I'm not saying that you have to become a church, but the answers are there.
I mean, my thinking is that the Pope isn't the best candidate on earth, right? So, and we're not very good at picking the best candidate on earth.
And we can't.
But I think we can learn to do better at picking the best candidate on earth.
Maybe we can. Yeah. But not by defining the whole system and figuring out what that means, because we still need to define better. And I don't think we can even do that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something to being explicit in your policy for receiving feedback from people. So it could be a random number generator, and that could be your policy, right? Here's all the criticisms. I
don't think policy is going to fix the problem at all. I think that research fixes the problem. And had John done some research, right, and had Paul done some research, they would have realized that Nathan, look, Jacob did this on the stream. I said, just go to Nathan's channel, right? And Jacob thought that, the titles of the videos were enough. And I'm like, I don't even think that's enough, because he's clickbaity. But if you watch his videos, look, the guy did a 3-hour stream on my, criticizing my stream my video with Vanderklay. That's not a good faith act. I was just telling my story. Like, what, why would you, what's there to, and the funny part was, apparently he's taken philosophy and he doesn't understand Descartes at all. And he didn't understand my Descartes joke, which is very funny, by the way. So he can't be that bright, irrespective of how well educated he is or how old he is. I've met lots of older people who just aren't that bright. Like, some people aren't that bright. You cannot solve these problems. There's too many variables. They're combinatorial explosive, to use some fancy Vervaeke words, right? They're combinatorial explosive, but you don't need to. We already have ways to solve these problems. And I understand that nobody's happy with how good they are, but we already have them. And they've been developed over thousands of years. And so they work pretty well. They're not perfect, but they work pretty well. They work better than anything we've come up with since, that's for sure. Yeah,
I mean, how long will it take for this convective heat engine to get created? Is it going to take 40 more years for how long? That's the thing, is theoretically there's potentially this thing, and there's these signals out among the entire world population on the internet that are potentially very important that can get ignored for long periods of time. And
right. But most of them should get ignored. I mean, how many free energy device systems are on YouTube right now? How many free energy device videos are on YouTube right now? Yeah. And look, I'll occasionally click on one because I find them super amusing, right? Because I just like watching stupid stuff. Like, I'll engage in conspiracy theories and all that sometimes, right? In a very limited fashion, because it's entertainment, and I like to be entertained. So I will entertain myself occasionally, right? But most of the stuff I do is listening to videos of people talking and doing analysis and doing engineering videos so I can learn something, or listening to Jonathan Blow, who I don't even like, talk about software, because sometimes he's dead on when he's talking about this stuff, right? And I could have my criticisms about the fact it's taking way too long to write a simple compiler, for example. It sort of indicates his language design is wrong. But and I could go on and on and on about that for hours, right? But it's not helpful, right? But I watch his stuff, and like that Collapse of Civilization video is excellent, right?
You're
He's
saying
right on.
people are here for entertainment? What are you talking about?
Some people are here for entertainment, right?
When
Believe that.
the drama explodes,
Well, and
you get the
we need
viewers.
that. We can't do without it, right? Like engineers would be like, I don't need entertainment. Yeah, all the most successful businesses in the world are entertainment businesses, you muppet. We need entertainment. We do need it. It feeds our soul, right? It feeds what's true, good, and beautiful in us.
Well, but that seems related to like these kinds of addictions, that where you can you're basically that rat pushing the button to get cocaine, because, it's like, that's how a lot of this software and how a lot of products are getting attention. That's what they get is attention, and it's a finite good. It's a what do they call it?
You need measurable things. You need them. You can't do without them. But you need quality more, and you need quality first. And when you don't make the measurable things subject to quality, they will fail with fair regularity. And so you need to go after the true, the good, the beautiful. You need an aim that matters. That aim needs to be true to somebody, right? Some group and it needs to be true enough that they're willing to pay for it, right? Or give it some credence and value, or cooperate with it.
So what's an example of like a true, good, and beautiful thing created by like $1 billion, net worth CEO? True, good, and beautiful thing.
Well, I mean, I think you can make the arguments for Starlink there pretty easily, right? I think you could make the argument for the for the Tesla. Like, I think those are reasonable arguments. Now, I have my disagreements with the idea of Tesla, right? But I have no disagreements on Starlink. I think Starlink's a pretty interesting project, actually. I'm not going to buy it because I don't need it.
And what about in the entertainment business? Is the true, good, and the beautiful hitting the top of the charts in the entertainment world?
Well, it used to. So then the question is, why isn't it anymore? And part of that is the corruption of the people in the system who are corrupt, right? Who don't care about that. And Critical Drinker talks about that a lot. If you haven't been listened to Critical Drinker's channel, man, whew, that is awesome. He is hysterical.
I've heard him I've heard it when Paul plays him, but I haven't really watched him myself.
No, it's really good, especially so he talks about the corruption of something like She-Hulk, right, or Rings of Power recently, and there's other stuff he's talked about in the past. It's really good.
Then he's gonna bias my innocent view, my innocent perspective, where I was like, this is all right. And then he's gonna give me the information and make me like, oh man, this is terrible. He's gonna turn me against it.
Right, potentially, but maybe it's good to know that it's terrible, because maybe it's terrible and corrupting you in a way that you don't want to be corrupted.
I'm not being very good at saying hey to everyone who comes in.
Yeah, well, Sally will get over it. She knows we love her. I talk to Sally every day anyway. So
awesome.
I met Sally. I was out at her house for a few days. That was lovely.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see the true, good, and the beautiful in Starlink and engineering projects and things that improve I hate to use the word quality now because
quality is important. Well, it's the most important thing.
I'm reminded of you've got people stuck at the bottom of this curve, and it's nice if you can have a rising tide lift all boats, and so
it does generally.
But it's there's a quantitative thing there that's very important. And it's connected to quality.
It's actually, this is the problem. Most people don't realize this. You can do without the quantitative piece entirely in most cases, and everything's fine. And that happens all the time. And everything in the past before science worked that way. Everything. So the idea that you need the quantitative side is actually observably just wrong. It's just factually incorrect.
Well, I mean, people supposedly went from hunting and gathering into domesticating plants so that you can have more predictable supply of food.
Without science and without measurement, because they didn't have science back then. It didn't exist.
But that changed the that changed that was like a rising tide lifting boats in order to create a more predictable supply of food, right?
Right,
So,
without measurement. Right, without measurement, without science, without standards, without propositions. Yep,
but
that
there's,
happened all based on quality alone, right?
but I mean,
That is the history of the world, is quality first and quality primary. And now look, now if you want to make improvements, then you need measurement. And measurement's great for that. Like engineering's a wonderful. I'm an engineer. Like I love engineering. Engineering's awesome, right? Like you need engineering to make things that much better, right? But you don't need them to make things. Right.
I
And
guess,
this is what I was saying about money. You don't need money to start your project to make $1 million, but you do need passion, right? You need equality.
yeah, I guess the things that can be measured, it's easier to make a determination on whether it's good and true, right? Then beautiful ends up being almost. It seems more subjective, but oftentimes this good, true, and beautiful does seem very subjective. So I try to stay away from the subjective. Is what I try to do.
Well, but that's what drives you. And that's the problem. Like people are not motivated by money the way people think. And again, you can pay people all day long and they can do exactly what they're told, but the project will fail. And the thing that makes projects work is the passion. And it may not be your passion. You may be borrowing it from the project leader. I've seen that happen before where, these guys who just failed another project and they were put under this new manager,
Have you?
and the new manager just imbued them with a passion for the project. And suddenly these unproductive engineers who couldn't code hello world if their lives depended upon it and they had a book in front of them with the code, suddenly built something unbelievably complicated that nobody thought could be built. And the difference was not the team, because that's not what makes the difference. Like, I know you want to believe that as an engineer, but it's observably false. Lots of things just happened because of passion. And the best projects, and if you read about business startups in particular, those projects start from passion, and they don't start from money. They start from passion, and it's the passion, and the people usually know that makes the project work. And you can look at Disney, for example, and you can say, well, where's the true, the good, and the beautiful in the older Disney projects? You can look at something like Pixar. Read it, or you can read it, or you can look up. There's a video on the history of Pixar that talks about the one guy that built Pixar, the one guy that made Pixar work. And when he left, the Pixar movies started to suck more. I'm not saying they're terrible, but I'm saying the early ones when he was still with the project. And guess what he did, by the way? He slept under his desk. It wasn't Elon Musk. So, right? Why would you sleep under your desk? He wasn't making that kind of huge amount of money back then. It was the first movie. It's a passion project. That's what makes you sleep under your desk, right?
Yeah, well,
and that's the thing.
There's what I experience is something like OCD, just becoming obsessed, right? And that, to me, that's when you say passion, that's what comes to mind for me.
Right, but that's not passion. So look, we have a comment, right? Not just passion, but simple networking of brains, right? And the right. So yeah, what causes the brains to want to network? Because I'm an individual and you're an individual and Gavin's an individual and Jacob's an individual, right? And CW's an individual. And why the hell should we get together and network the brains? Why? What aim do we have in common? Well, we do have aims in common, right? And that's the passion that we have for the projects that we have that cross over, right? Whether they be this 24/7, this little corner of the internet news network or whatever the heck Jacob's planning, or whether they're just a passion for debate or learning or teaching, in my case, right? It doesn't really matter, right? Or betterment in general, right? That's the passion that allows the brains to network. You need that. That creates the space in which to do the networking and gives you the common aim so that you're all pointed roughly at the same thing or oriented towards the same thing. And that's what makes things happen.
Yeah, so the reason I'm here is because I was on Facebook and trying to just, realizing that no conversations are happening and nobody seems to be good at conversations. And I'll try to engage one of my Facebook friends and it just doesn't work. It just never works. And so I went on a search years ago for conversations, understanding that it's something that I needed to learn how to do. It's something that the world needs to learn how to do. And so that's why I think having these that's part of the reason why I think having these live streams are important. And then another part of it is, I've had this idea that we don't trust our leaders, and rightfully so. And so I've always kind of had this idea that I want to record myself. I've been doing it for like 10 years. And then having it even live streamed, it allows me. So in 20 years from now, there's going to be this collection, assuming I live, there'll be a collection of all of this stuff about me and about whoever is doing these live streams or whomever. And that will end up being the thing like that maybe helps people gain trust, right? Or lose trust, and rightfully so. So that's kind of like, I see these things as actually being important and part of the future that needs to happen. Like, I really do think they're important.
Yeah, they are important. But look, Facebook's a problem because it's text only. And so in text, I can't convey passion. I can't convey the quality of my ideas. Quality can't be conveyed in propositions. This is the problem with measurement. When you measure something, you kill it. You turn it into dead matter. I have a video on that, by the way. All right, consciousness, unconsciousness, and dead matter. Right. So when you turn it into dead matter, and look, Plato made that. This is not new. This is not me coming up with something by myself. Right. Plato talked about this. Socrates talked about this. Right. You're turning it into dead matter. You're killing it, which is fine. Maybe that's okay. Right. And I was using this example. Maybe this will work. So you can know a bunch of things about an individual frog by dissecting it, but you've killed it. Now, let's suppose it cost you 5 brain power points, right, in your cognitive load system to learn that. And let's assume further that that's all you have free available in your cognitive system, because at some point there are limits to cognition, right? And so what if it cost you 5 cognitive points, the same 5 points, you only have 5, to learn how to interface with all frogs in a generative manner, or to help them mate or something like that, or to keep their eggs safe, right? One of them, you're going to learn a bunch of things about one frog that's unique, because all frogs are unique, because evolution is real, and each frog is going to have variations, right? Cost you 5 points. The same 5 points you could spend to be generative and learn how to nurture frogs such that they grow and then make more frogs, right? There are limitations. And some of those limitations are around making things dead matter, carving them up, trying to measure them, trying to use these measurements, right? I'm not saying that that's bad. I said earlier, it can be good, right? But we can take it too far. And like, that's when things like too much information becomes an issue. But you need the quality of the passion of my voice, right? My tone, the speed at which I'm speaking, right? You need that stuff, right, in order to cooperate better. And you're not going to get it in text on Facebook when you propositionalize or kill everything that you're speaking.
So, yeah, so I did notice that the words like can be interpreted multiple ways, and that's something I've noticed. And people tended to interpret them based on their own perception and worldview, and they tended to not consider perhaps that this other person may know something they don't, or maybe sees things in a different way. And I like to give credit to reading a bunch of science fiction that, for like, getting into the mind of a character in a science fiction book has helped me have more empathy. At least that's my claim. But I want to point at this. This is interesting. C.W. Weeks, when he asks these questions, I don't know who is it aimed at or anything, similar to what you had said earlier, your troll test. But yeah, I could, like we could say, was this towards someone in the chat, or was this toward Mark, or was this toward me?
Oh no, CW is jabbing at me, no doubt. He's mentioning teaching, and that was the word that I used. So I'm sure this is at me. It was so disappointing. He didn't come after me at all at Thunder Bay. We could have had so much fun arguing in person. Chose not to. Lovely time seeing him in Thunder Bay, though. Yeah, look, I mean, look, teaching it. Nobody teaches the way he suggests. At least I've never seen it. I'm sure that people view things that way, but I'm not doing it as a job. To his later comment here, I'm not doing it as a job, right? I'm teaching by exemplification, right? I'm exemplifying what I do, because people have expressed an interest in, what do you do, Mark? You were homeless, and you've bought 2 houses now. I lost one, but and there's a success there that people want to know. And Yeah, we meditate on the server every morning pretty much, although I've been lax lately because I keep getting up late. Uh, but we're doing things, and that's how you teach people. You teach people through exemplification, not just through propositions. And we've lost that in education, right? We took religion out of schools, we took gym out of schools, we took art out of schools, and we took music out of schools. All at the same time, by the way. Those are all qualitative features. And now schools are made up of dead matter. They're made up of training, not education. I'm going to do a video on that. I was actually going to record it tonight, but I got sick this afternoon, so I didn't have time to do any recording. So, yeah, I mean, training is not as helpful as it seems. And when you try to train a software engineer, you get a software engineer that can't code, right? Because they need specifications and all these other things in order to do the interpretation of what it should look like in code. And so you're putting the burden on the analyst, right? And not allowing the software engineer to do more of the work. That's why when you introduce them to something like the idea of a story from a user, they can't translate that into code because they didn't learn that. They learned a bunch of propositions around recursion and variables, which are all helpful things to learn. You have to know that to code, but they're not sufficient to write good software.
Best kind of teaching, perhaps leading through example. Mark and Manuel excel at this.
Thank you, CW. I agree. I think we do struggle to try to excel at that as much as we can.
Well, I do need to get to bed soon, and I could keep talking for another 3 hours. I really could, but I enjoyed it, Mark.
It was good, Gavin. I'm glad we got to do this. I'm glad we did it on the live stream to make Jacob happy. And hopefully that'll help him on his project because we're using his live stream and he's got this big 24/7, this little corner dream. So yeah, it was lovely. I'm glad we finally got to straighten some stuff out. And yeah, I've got a bunch of, well, there's a bunch of stuff on Ontology on Clubhouse, but I've also got a bunch of Meaning Monday talks with Manuel and Anne on Clubhouse that we've been doing. And those are around community and some of these other issues. So there's more material to engage with. Eventually, I'm going to make that a podcast, but it's just getting stuff done has been difficult. So
is Clubhouse? I think last time I had heard of Clubhouse, it was just Apple. So I'm guessing it's now on Google.
It's on Android. You can get it on the web too. Android. Actually, okay. Yeah, a lot of the Clubhouse talks are actually available in the BOM Share Your Content stream. I haven't done the latest ones, but they are available there. I'm going to turn them into a podcast eventually.
You would have to share it in a different server for me. I'm not allowed in BOM.
You're not allowed in BOM?
No. I tried to criticize the moderator. It didn't work out.
That's not a good idea. Yeah, you submit to moderation. You don't criticize. Moderation's really hard. It's really, really hard. And
my idea was to have a prison channel. Like it seems like if you're a person who says things you shouldn't say, it would be nice to be pushed into a channel where maybe you can only say one thing over a large period of time. So you really have to think about what you say before you say it. But I was trying to provide that idea or suggestion. And then I probably did it in the wrong way because I'm not good with words. And it got perceived in a way that was not the way I intended it. I'm sure that happened as well because it happens all the time.
You can petition the people running the BOM server now to get reinstated.
I already did. I don't know. I didn't get a verdict.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what happened. So anyways, if you share it I'm in Jacob's Ladder and I'm in Broken Clock Tower, and I don't pay as much attention to the Meaning Crisis channel or server. It's just a lot more people there. I kind of like a smaller community in general, but yeah. So if you were to share it in any of those, I would probably see it.
I think some of them are shared in Awakening.
Okay.
Once you get to one, you can get to them all. So okay. You can look.
So I can look it up in Awakening, in that there's a Share Your Content channel there, so I can check it out.
Yeah. Good luck with that. And then everybody should forget all their other YouTube channels and just subscribe to Navigating Patterns, which is mine, and watch all my videos and comment on all of them and like all of them because they're all awesome. And give me feedback so I can make them more awesomer because that's important.
Awesome. All right. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, audience.
Thanks, Gavin.
And
It was,
audience,
it was great.
you're always welcome to hop in the chat. I should have been more inviting, but maybe I'll get better. So
We'll get better over time. It'll be
yeah.
great. Have a great night, everybody. It was lovely
Bye-bye.
talking.